Alrighty, sorry about the delay. And sorry if this winds up being kind of a low energy stream today. I am recuperating, and otherwise not at 100%. Um, but welcome back to Wordy-Wednesdays, which is currently acting as an additional extension of Free Read Fridays at the moment. We are going to be reading some more of Hyperion by Dan Simmons. Chapter 3, in fact, which includes The Poet's Tale. And we were in for some profanity. There's going to be quite a bit. Um, I'm sorry about the last one, which had a substantial amount of hot, heart-pounding violence and sexy time. But that's the way it goes sometimes. That's the way you just might find yourself in the clutches of some wild love. Do 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 do. Oh gosh, Frank Zappa, the gift that never stops giving. Anyway, so yeah, they are making our pilgrims are making their way up the river. We've been through how many character backstories now? At least two, three. Is it three? No, it's not three. It's Kassad and Lennar Hoyt we've heard from so far. Let me skip ahead here, see what time frame I'm looking at for the next chapter, and follow up so that I can plan a little bit ahead as to what I'm going to do. Okay, one after that is their tale. That is a lot fewer pages, but we might just have to deal with it because that's one of the longer segments, as I recall. Actually, I think the long segment. Yeah, it's just on the outside of time frame doability. Yeah, 70 pages is kind of a toughie. It's doable, but it's a bit much. So tentatively, Friday will be a very short one, which is probably just as well. And oh, I get to finally start using Sea of Grass cover images. Again, this will be nice. I say again, I mean at all, not again. Anyway, yeah. So, sit down, relax, take it easy as best you can, and brace for Chapter 3 in all its glory and The Poet's Tale. Spoilers! 2 pages from now, we're gonna start reading The Poet's Tale. Oh my goodness, I've spoiled everything. Anyway, um, okay. Let me get all my kit and caboodle here together, and we'll get cracking. Chapter 3. The barge Benares entered the river port of Naiad an hour before sunset. Crew and pilgrims pressed to the rail to stare at smoldering embers of what once had been a city of 20,000 people. Little remained. The famous Riverfront Inn, built in the days of Sad King Billy, had burned to the foundations. Its charred docks, piers, and screen balconies now collapsed into the shallows of the Hooghly. The custom house was a burned-out shell. The airship terminal on the north end of town survived only as a blackened hulk, its mooring tower reduced to a spire of charcoal. There was no sign whatsoever of the small riverfront Shrike temple. Worst of all, from the pilgrim's point of view, was the destruction of the Naiad River Station. The harness dock lay burned and sagging, the manta holding pens open to the river. "God damn it!" said Martin Silenus.
"Who did it?" asked Father Hoyt. "The Shrike?"
"More likely the SDF," said the consul, "although they may have been fighting the Shrike." "I can't believe this!" snapped Braun Lamia. She turned to A. Beddock, who had just joined them on the rear deck. "Didn't you know this had happened?"
"No, no," said the android. "There has been no contact with any point north of the locks for more than a week."
"Why the hell not?" asked Lamia. "Even if this godforsaken world doesn't have a datasphere, don't you have radio?" A. Beddock smiled slightly.
"Yes, Lamia, there is radio, but the comsats are down. The microwave repeater stations at the Karla locks were destroyed, and we have no access to the shortwave."
"What about the mantas?" asked Kassad. "Can we press on to edge with the ones we have?"
Beddock frowned. "We will have to, Colonel," he said, "but it is a crime. The two in harness will not recover from such a pull. With fresh mantas we would have to put into edge before dawn. With these two—" The android shrugged. "With luck, if the beasts survive, we will arrive by early afternoon."
"The wind wagon will still be there, will it not?" asked Het Mastine.
"We must assume so," said A. Beddock. "If you will excuse me, I will see to feeding the poor beasts we have. We should be under way again within the hour."
They saw no one in or near the ruins of Naiad. No river craft made their appearance above the city. An hour's pull northeast of the town they entered. What? An hour's pull northeast of the town they entered the region. Oh, I'm dumb. It's a line break through me. Sorry. Let me just take the paragraph from the top. They saw no one in or near the ruins of Naiad. No river craft made their appearance above the city. An hour's pull northeast of the town they entered. Oh, sorry. An hour's pull northeast of the town, they entered the region where the forests and farms of the lower Hooghly gave way to the undulating orange prairie south of the Sea of Grass. Occasionally the consul would see the mud towers of architect ants, some of their serrated structures near the river reaching almost 10 meters in height. There was no sign of intact human habitation. The ferry at Betty's Ford was totally gone, with not even a tow rope or a warming shack left to show where it had stood for almost 2 centuries. The River Runner's Inn at Cave Point was dark and silent. A. Beddock and the other crew members hallooed, but there was no response from the black cave mouth. Sunset brought a sensuous stillness over the river, soon broken by a chorus of insect noises and night-bird calls. For a while the surface of the Hooghly became a mirror of the gray-green disk of twilight sky, disturbed only by the leap of dusk-feeding fish and the wake of the laboring mantas. As true darkness fell, innumerable prairie gossamers, much paler than their forest cousins, but also of greater wingspan, luminescent shades the size of small children, danced in the vales and valleys of the gently rolling hills.
By the time the constellations emerged and the meteor trails began scarring the night sky, a brilliant display this far from all man-made light, the lanterns. A brilliant display this far from all man-made light, sorry. Let's try that sentence again. My bad. We're already having a hard time. By the time the constellations emerged and the meteor trails began scarring the night sky, I'm having a hard time with consonants today. Meteor trails began scarring the night sky, a brilliant display this far from all man-made light. The lanterns had been lit, and dinner set out on the aft deck. The Shrike pilgrims were subdued, as if contemplating Colonel Kassad's grim and confusing tale. The consul had been drinking steadily since before midday, and now he felt the pleasant displacement from reality, from the pain of memory, which allowed him to get through each day and night. Now he asked, his voice as careful and unslurred as only a true alcoholic's can be, whose turn it was to tell a tale. "Mine," said Martin Silenus. The poet had also had been drinking steadily since early in the day. His voice was as carefully controlled as the consul's, but redness on his sharp cheeks and an almost manic brightness of eye gave the old poet away. "At least I drew number 3. He held up his slip of paper. "If you still want to hear the fucking thing. If you still want to hear the fucking thing." Braun Lamia lifted her glass of wine, scowled, and set it down. "Perhaps we should talk about what we have learned from the first 2 stories and how it might relate to our current situation." "Not yet," said Colonel Kassad. "We don't have enough information." "Let M. Silenus speak," said Saul Weintraub. "Then we can begin discussing what we have heard." "I agree," said Lenar Hoyt. Het Mastine and the consul nodded. "Agreed!" cried Martin Silenus. "I'll tell my story. Just let me finish my fucking glass of wine." The Poet's Tale. Hyperion Cantos. In the beginning was the Word. Then came the fucking word processor. Then came the thought processor. Then came the death of literature. And so it goes. Francis Bacon once said, "There arises from a bad and unapt formation of words a wonderful obstruction of the mind." We have all contributed our wonderful obstructions to the mind, have we not? I more than most. One of the 20th century's better forgotten writers, that is, better, forgotten, once bon moted. I love being a writer. It's the paperwork I can't stand. Get it? Well, amigos and amiguette, I love being a poet. It's the goddamn words I can't stand. Where to start? Start with Hyperion, perhaps? Fade in. Almost 2 standard centuries ago. Sad King Billy's 5 seed ships spin like gold dandelions above this all too familiar lapis sky. We land like conquistadors strutting to and fro. More than 2,000 visual artists and writers and sculptors and poets and arnists and vid makers and holy directors and composers and decomposers and God knows what all, supported by 5 times that many administrators and technicians and ecologists and supervisors and court chamberlains and professional ass-kissers, not to mention the family of royal asses themselves, supported in turn by 10 times that many androids willing to till the soil and stoke the reactors and raise the cities and lift that bale and tote that load. Hell, you get the idea. We landed on a world already seeded by the poor buggers who'd gone indigene 2 centuries before, and were living hand to mouth and cudgel to brain wherever they could. Naturally, the noble descendants of these brave pioneers greeted us like gods, especially after a few of our security folks slagged a few of their more aggressive leaders, and naturally we accepted their worship as our due, and put them to work next to our blueskins, plowing the South 40 and working to build our shining city on the hill. And it was a shining city on a hill. Seeing the ruins today can tell you nothing of the place. The desert has advanced in 3 centuries. The aqueducts from the mountains have fallen and shattered. The city itself is only bones. But in its day, the city of poets was fair indeed, a bit of Socrates' Athens with the intellectual excitement of Renaissance Venice, the artistic fervor of Paris in the days of the Impressionists, the true democracy of the first decade of Orbit City, and the unlimited future of Tau Ceti Center. But in the end, it was none of these things, of course. It was only Hrothgar's claustrophobic mead hall, with the monster waiting in the darkness without. We had our Grendel, to be sure. We even had our Hrothgar, if one squints a bit at sad King Billy's poor slouched profile. We only lacked our Geats, our great, broad-shouldered, small-brained Beowulf with his band of merry psychopaths. So, lacking a hero, we settled into the role of victims, and composed our sonnets, and rehearsed our ballets, and unrolled our scrolls, while all the while our thorn and steel Grendel served the night with fear, and harvested thigh bones and gristle. And this was when I, a satyr then, formed in flesh as mirror to my soul, came as close to accompanying my cantos, came as close to completing my cantos, my life's work, as I have come in 5 sad centuries of stubborn continuance. Fade to black. It occurs to me that the Grendel tale is premature. The players have not been brought upon the stage. Dislinear plotting and non-contiguous prose have their adherents, not the least of which am I. But in the end, my friends, it is character which wins or loses immortality upon the vellum. Haven't you ever harbored the secret thought that somewhere Huck and Jim are, at this instant, poling their raft down some river just beyond our reach? So much more real are they than the shoe clerk who fitted us just a forgotten day ago? At any rate, if this fucking story's to be told, you should know who's in it. So, as much as it pains me, I'll back up to begin at the beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was programmed in classic binary. And the Word said, "Let there be life." And so, somewhere in the technocore vaults of my mother's estate, frozen sperm from my long-dead daddy was defrosted, set in suspension, shaken like the vanilla malts of yore, loaded into something part squirt gun and part dildo, and, at the magic touch of a trigger, ejaculated into mother at a time when the moon was full and the egg was ripe. Mother didn't have to be impregnated in this barbaric fashion, of course. She could have chosen ex utero fertilization, a male lover with a transplant of daddy's DNA, a clonal surrogate, a gene-spliced virgin birth, you name it. But, as she told me later, she opened her legs to tradition. My guess is that she preferred it that way. Anyway, I was born. I was born on Earth. Old Earth, and fuck you, Lamia, if you don't believe it. We lived on Mother's estate on an island not far from the North American Preserve. Notes for sketch of home on Old Earth. fragile twilights fading from violet to fuchsia to purple above the crepe paper silhouettes of trees beyond the southwest sweep of lawn. Skies as delicate as translucent china, unscarred by cloud or contrail. The pre-symphony hush of first light followed by the cymbal crash of sunrise. Oranges and russets igniting to gold, the long, cool descent to green. Leaf shadow, shade, tendrils of cypress and weeping willow, the hushed green velvet of the glade. Mother's estate, our estate, 1,000 acres centered in 1,000,000 more. Lawns the size of small prairies with grass so perfect it beckoned a body to lie upon it, to nap on its soft perfection. Noble shade trees making sundials of the earth, their shadows circling in stately procession, now mingling, now contracting to midday, finally stretching eastward with the dying of the day. Royal oak, giant elms, cottonwood trunks like smooth-sided columns in a temple roofed by sky. Willows lining carefully laid canals and haphazard streams, their hanging branches singing ancient dirges to the wind. Our house rises on a low hill where, in the winter, the browning curves of lawn look like the smooth flank of some female beast, all thigh muscle and meant for speed. The house shows its centuries of accretion, a jade tower on the east courtyard catching the first light of dawn, a series of gables on the south wing throwing triangles of shadow on the crystal conservatory at tea time, the balconies and maze of exterior stairways along the east porticos playing Escher games with afternoon's shadows. It was after the big mistake, but before everything grew uninhabitable. Mostly, we occupied the estate during what we quaintly called periods of remission, stretches of 10 to 18 quiet months between planet-wide spasms as the Kiev team's goddamn little black hole digested bits of the Earth's center and waited for its next feast. During the bad times, we vacationed at Uncle Kawa's place out beyond the moon on a terraformed asteroid brought there before the ouster migration. You might already be able to tell that I was born with a silver spoon up my ass. I offer no apologies. After 3,000 years of dabbling with democracy, the remaining old Earth families had come to the realization that the only way to avoid such riffraff was not to allow them to breed. Or, rather, to sponsor seed ship fleets, spin ship explorations, new Farcaster migrations, all of the panicked urgency of the Hedgera, as long as they bred out there and left old Earth alone. The fact that the homeworld was a diseased old bitch, gone in the teeth, didn't hurt the riffraff's urge to pioneer. No fools they. And like the Buddha, I was almost grown before I saw my first hint of poverty. I was 16 standard years old, on my wanderyar, and backpacking through India when I saw a beggar. The Hindu old families kept them around for religious reasons, but all I knew at the time was that here was a man in rags, ribs showing, holding out a wicker basket with an ancient credit disc key in it, begging for a touch of my universal card. My friends thought it was hysterical. I threw up. I was in Benares. My childhood was privileged, but not obnoxiously so. I have pleasant memories of Grand Dame Sybil's famous parties. She was a great aunt on my mother's side. I remember one 3-day affair she threw in the Manhattan archipelago, guests ferried in by dropship from Orbit City and from the European arcologies. I remember the Empire State Building rising from the water, its many lights reflecting on the lagoons and fern canals, the EMVs unloading passengers on the observation deck while cooking fires burned on the overgrown island mounds of lower buildings all around. The North American Preserve was our private playground in those days. It was said that about 8,000 people still resided in that mysterious continent, but half of these were rangers. The rest included the renegade arnists who plied their trade by resurrecting species of plants and animals. That's A-R-N-ist, capital A-R-N. Arnists who plied their trade by resurrecting species of plants and animals long absent from their antediluvian North American haunts. The ecology engineers, licensed primitives such as the Ogallala Sioux or the Hells Angel Guild, and the occasional tourist. I had a cousin who reportedly backpacked from one observation zone to the other in the preserve, but he did so in the Midwest, where the zones were relatively close together and where the dinosaur herds were much scarcer. In the first century after the big mistake, Gaia was mortally injured but slow in the dying. The devastation was great during the bad times, and these came more often in precisely plotted spasms, shorter remissions, and more terrible consequences after each attack. But the earth abided and repaired itself as best it could. The preserve was, as I say, our playground, but, in a real sense, so was all of the dying earth. Mother let me have my own EMV when I was 7, and there was no place on the globe farther than an hour's flight from home. My best friend, Amalfi Schwartz, lived in the Mount Erebus Estates in what had once been the Antarctic Republic. We saw each other daily. The fact that old Earth law forbade farcasters did not bother us in the least. Lying on some hillside at night, looking up through the 10,000 orbiting lights and the 20,000 beacons of the ring at the 2,000 or 3,000 visible stars, we felt no jealousy, no urge to join the Hegira that even then was spinning the farcaster silk of the world web. We were happy. My memories of Mother are oddly stylized, as if she was another fictional construct from one of my Dying Earth novels. Perhaps she was. Perhaps I was raised by robots in the automated cities of Europe, suckled by androids in the Amazon desert, or simply grown in a vat like brewer's yeast. What I recall is Mother's white gown sliding ghost-like through the shadowed rooms of the estate, infinitely delicate blue veins on the back of her thin-fingered hand as she poured tea in the damask and dusk light of the conservatory, candlelight caught like a gold fly in the spiderweb sheen of her hair done up in a bun in the style of the grande dames. Sometimes I dream that I remember her voice, the lilt and tone and turn in the womb centerness of it. But then I awake, and it becomes only the wind moving lace curtains or the sound of some alien sea on stone. From my earliest sense of self, I knew that I should be, a poet. It was not as if I had a choice. More like the dying beauty all about breathed its last breath in me and let's try that sentence again because we've just totally thrown it. We'll just take the paragraph from the top. From my earliest sense of self, I knew that I should be, a poet. It was not as if I had a choice. More like the dying beauty all about breathed its last breath in me and commanded that I be doomed to play with words the rest of my days, as if in expiation for our race's thoughtless slaughter of its crib world. So, what the hell? I became a poet. I had a tutor whose name was Balthazar, human but ancient, a refugee from ancient Alexandria's flesh-scented alleys. Balthazar all but glowed blue-white from those crude, early Poulsen treatments. He was like an irradiated mummy of a man sealed in liquid plastic. And Randy is the proverbial goat. Centuries later, when I was in my satyr period, I felt that I finally understood poor Don Balthazar's priapic compulsions, but in those days it was mostly a hindrance to keeping young girls on the estate's staff. Human or android, Don Balthazar did not discriminate. He poinked them all. Luckily for my education, there was nothing homosexual in Don Balthazar's addiction to young flesh, so his escapades evidenced themselves either as absences from our tutorial sessions or an inordinate amount of attention lavished on memorizing verses from Ovid, Sinesh, or Wu. He was an excellent tutor. We studied the ancients and the late classical period, took field trips to the ruins of Athens, Rome, London, and Hannibal, Missouri, and never once had a quiz or test. Don Balthazar expected me to learn everything by heart and at heart Don Balthazar expected me to learn everything by heart at first encounter, and I did not disappoint him. He convinced my mother that the pitfalls of progressive education were not for an old Earth family, so I never knew the mind-stunting shortcuts of RNA medication, datasphere immersion, systemic flashback training, stylized encounter groups, higher-level thinking skills at the expense of facts, or pre-literate programming. As a result of these deprivations, I was able to recite all of Fitzgerald's translation of the Odyssey by the time I was 6, compose a sestina before I could dress myself, and think in spiral fugue verse before I ever interfaced with an AI. My scientific education, on the other hand, was something less than stringent. Don Balthazar had little interest in what he referred to as the mechanical side of the universe. I was 22 before I realized that computers, RMUs, and Uncle Kawa's asteroidal life support devices were machines and not some benevolent manifestations of the animas around us. I believed in fairies, wood sprites, numerology, astrology, and the magic of Midsummer's Eve deep in the primitive forests of the NAP. Like Keats and Lamb in Haydn's studio, Don Balthazar and I drank toasts to the confusion of mathematics and mourned the destruction of the poetry of the rainbow by M. Newton's prying prism. The early distrust and actual hatred of all things scientific and clinical served me well in later life. It is not difficult, I have learned, to remain a pre-Copernican pagan in the post-scientific hegemony. My early poetry was execrable. As with most bad poets, I was unaware of this fact, secure in my arrogance that the very act of creating gave some worth to the worthless abortions I was spawning. My mother remained tolerant even as I left reeking little piles of doggerel lying around the house. She was indulgent of her only child, even if he was as blithely incontinent as an unhousebroken llama. Don Balthazar never commented on my work, primarily, I assume, because I never showed him any of it. Don Balthazar thought that the venerable Dayton was a fraud, that Salmud Brevi and Robert Frost should have hanged themselves with their own entrails, that Wordsworth was a fool, and that anything less than Shakespeare's sonnets was a profanation of the language. I saw no reason to bother Don Balthazar with my verse, rife with budding genius, though I knew it to be. I published several of these little literary turds in the various hard-copy journals then in vogue in the various arcologies of the European houses, the amateur editors of these crude journals being as indulgent of my mother as she was of me. Occasionally I would press Amalfi or one of my other playmates, less aristocratic than I, and thus with access to the datasphere or fatline transmitters, to uplink some of my verses to the Ring or to Mars, and thus to the burgeoning Farcaster colonies. They never replied. I assumed they were too busy. Belief in one's identity as a poet or writer prior to the acid test of publication is as naive and harmless as the youthful belief in one's immortality, and the inevitable disillusionment is just as painful. My mother died with old Earth. About half the old families stayed during that last cataclysm. I was 20 years old then and had made my own romantic plans to die with the home world. Mother decided otherwise. What concerned her was not my premature demise. Like me, she was far too self-centered to think of someone else at a time like that, nor even the fact that the death of my DNA would mark the end of a line of aristocrats which stretched back to the Mayflower. No. What bothered Mother was that the family was going to die out in debt. Our last 100 years of extravagance, it seems, had been financed through massive loans from the Ring Bank and other discreet extraterrestrial institutions. Now that the continents of Earth were crashing under the impact of contraction, the great forests aflame, the oceans heaving and heating themselves into a lifeless soup, the very air transforming itself into something too hot and too thick to break and too thin to plow, now the banks wanted their money back. I was collateral. Or rather, Mother's plan was. She liquidated all available assets some week before that phrase became a literal reality, deposited $250,000 in long-term accounts in the fleeing Ring Bank, and dispatched me on a trip to the Rifkin Atmospheric Protectorate on Heaven's Gate, a minor world circling the star Vega. Even then, that poisonous world had a Farcaster connection to Sol's system, but I did not Farcast. Nor was I a passenger on the single spin ship with Hawking drive, which put in to Heaven's Gate each standard year. No, Mother sent me to this back end of the outback on a Phase 3 ramship, slower than light, frozen with the cattle embryos and orange juice concentrate and feeder viruses, on a trip that took 129 shipboard years, with an objective time debt of 167 standard years. Mother figured that the accrued interest on the long-term accounts would be enough to pay off our family debt and perhaps allow me to survive comfortably for a while. For the first and last time in her life, Mother figured wrong. Notes for a sketch of Heaven's Gate. Mud lanes which run back from the station's conversion docks like a pattern of sores on a leper's back. Sulfurous brown. I'm assuming that's sulfurous. It's spelled S-U-F-U-R-S. No, sorry, S-U-F-R-U-S. So I'm just going to assume it's missing an L. Sulphurous brown clouds which hang in tatters from a rotten burlap sky. A tangle of shapeless wooden structures half decayed before they were ever fully constructed, their paneless windows now staring sightlessly into the gaping mouths of their neighbors. Indigenes breeding like humans, I suppose. Eyeless cripples, lungs burned out with air rot, squiring a nest of a dozen offspring, the children's skin scabrous by age 5 standard, their eyes watering incessantly from the sting of an atmosphere which will kill them before they're 40, their smiles carious, their oily hair rife with lice and the blood bags of Dracula ticks. Proud parents beaming. 20 million of these doomed schmucks crowded into slums overflowing an island smaller than my family's west lawn on old Earth, all of them fighting to breathe the only breathable air on a world where the standard is to inhale and die, crowding ever closer to the center of the 60-mile radius of survivable atmosphere which the atmospheric generating station had been able to provide before it began to malfunction. Heaven's Gate, my new home. Mother had not taken into account the possibility that all old Earth accounts would be frozen, and then appropriated into the growing World Web economy. Nor had she remembered that the reason people had waited for the Hawking drive to see the spiral arm of the galaxy is that in long-term cryogenic sleep, as opposed to a few weeks or months of fugue, chances of terminal brain damage were 1 in 6. I was lucky. When I was uncrated on Heaven's Gate and put to work digging out acid canals beyond the perimeter, I had suffered only a cerebral accident, a stroke. Physically, I was able to work in the mud pits within a few local weeks. Mentally, there was much left to be desired. The left side of my brain had been shut down like a damaged section of a spin ship being sealed off, airtight doors leaving the doomed compartments open to vacuum. I could still think. Control of the right side of my body soon returned. Only the language centers had been damaged beyond simple repair. The marvelous organic computer wedged in my skull had dumped its language content like a flawed program. The right hemisphere was not without some language, but only the most emotionally charged units of communication could lodge in that affective hemisphere. My vocabulary was now down to 9 words. This, I learned later, was exceptional. Many victims of CVAs retain only 2 or 3 words. For the record, here is my entire vocabulary of manageable words. Fuck, shit, piss, cunt, goddamn, motherfucker, asshole, pee-pee, and poo-poo. A quick analysis will show some redundancy here. I had at my disposal 8 nouns, which stood for 6 things. 5 of the 8 nouns could double as verbs. I retained 1 indisputable noun and a single adjective, which also could be used as a verb or expletive. My new language universe was comprised of 4 monosyllables, 3 compound words, and 2 baby talk repetitions. My arena of literal expression offered 4 avenues to the topic of elimination, 2 references to human anatomy, 1 request for divine imprecation, 1 standard description of or request for coitus, and a coital variation which was no longer an option for me since my mother was deceased. All in all, it was enough. I will not say that I remember my 3 years in the mud pits and slime slums of Heaven's Gate with fondness, but it is true that these years were at least as formative as, and probably more so than, my previous 2 decades on old Earth. I soon found that among my intimate acquaintances, Old Sludge, the scoop shovel foreman, Unk, the slumyard bully to whom I paid my protection bribes, Kitty, the lice-ridden crib doxy whom I slept with when I could afford it, my vocabulary served me well. Shit fuck, I would grunt, gesticulating. Asshole, cunt, pee-pee fuck. Ah, grinned Old Sludge, showing his 1 tooth. Go to the company store to get some algae chewies, huh? Goddamn poo-poo, I would grin back at him. The life of a poet lies not merely in the finite language dance of expression, but in the nearly infinite combinations of perception and memory combined with the sensitivity to what is perceived and remembered. My 3 local years on Heaven's Gate, almost 1,500 standard days, allowed me to see, to feel, to hear, to remember, as if I literally had been born again. Little matter that I had been born again in hell. Reworked experience is the stuff of all true poetry, and raw experience was the birthing gift of my new life. There was no problem adapting to a brave new world a century and a half beyond my own. For all of our talk of expansion and pioneering spirit these past 5 centuries, we all know how stultified and static our human universe has become. We are in a comfortable dark ages of the inventive mind. Institutions change but little, and that by gradual evolution rather than revolution. Scientific research creeps crab-like in a lateral shuffle. Where once it leaped in great intuitive bounds, devices change even less. Plateau technologies, common to us, would be instantly identifiable and operable to our great grandfathers. So while I slept, the hegemony became a formal entity. The world web was spun to something close to its final shape. The all-thing took its democratic place among the list of humanity's benevolent despots. The technocore seceded from human service and then offered its help as an ally rather than as a slave. And the ousters retreated to darkness and the role of nemesis. But all these things had been creeping toward critical mass even before I was frozen into my ice coffin between between the pork bellies and sherbet, and such obvious extensions of old trends took little effort to understand. Besides, history viewed from the inside is always a dark, digestive mess, far different from the easily recognizable cow viewed from afar by historians. My life was Heaven's Gate. My life was Heaven's Gate, and the minute-to-minute demands of survival there. The sky was always an eternal yellow-brown sunset hanging like a collapsing ceiling mere meters above my shack. My shack was oddly comfortable. A table for eating, a cot for sleeping and fucking, a hole for pissing and shitting, and a window for staring. Silent staring. My environment mirrored my vocabulary. Prison has always Prison always has been a good place for writers, killing, as it does, the twin demons of mobility and diversion, and Heaven's Gate was no exception. The atmospheric protectorate owned my body, but my mind, or what was left of it, was mine. On old Earth, my poetry was composed on a Sadu Decanar comlog. Oh, sorry. Line breaks. On old Earth, my poetry was composed on a Sadu Decanar comlog thought processor while I lounged in a padded chaise lounge, lounge again, or floated in my EM barge above dark lagoons, or walked pensively through scented bowers. The execrable, undisciplined, limp-wristed, flatulent products of those reveries already have been described. On Heaven's Gate, I discovered what a mental stimulant physical labor could be. Not mere physical labor, I should add, but absolutely spine-bending, lung-racking, gut-ripping, ligament-tearing, and ball-breaking physical labor. But as long as the task is both onerous and repetitive, I discovered, the mind is not only free to wander to more imaginative climes, it actually flees to higher planes. Thus, on Heaven's Gate, as I dredged bottom scum from the slop canals under the red gaze of Vega Primo, or crawled on hands and knees through stalactites and stalagmites of rebreather bacteria in the station's labyrinthine lung pipes, I became a poet. All I lacked were the words. The 20th century's most honored writer, William Gass, once said in an interview, "Words are the supreme objects. They are minded things." And so they are. As pure and transcendent as any idea which ever cast a shadow into Plato's dark cave of our perceptions. But they are also pitfalls of deceit and misperception. Words bend our thinking to infinite paths of self-delusion, and the fact that we spend most of our mental lives in brain mansions built of words means that we lack the objectivity necessary to see the terrible distortion of reality which language brings. Example: the Chinese pictogram for honesty is a two-part symbol of a man literally standing next to his word. So far, so good. But what does the late English word integrity mean? Or motherland? Or progress? Or democracy? Or beauty? But even in our self-deception, we become gods. A philosopher-mathematician named Bertrand Russell, who lived and died in the same century as Gass, once wrote, "Language serves not only to express thought, but to make possible thoughts which could not exist without it." Here is the essence of mankind's creative genius. Not the edifices of civilization or the bang flash weapons which can end it, but the words which fertilize new concepts like spermatozoa attacking an ovum. It might be argued that the Siamese twin infants of word/idea are the only contribution the human species can, will, or should make to the raveling cosmos. Yes, our DNA is unique, but so is a salamander's. Yes, we construct artifacts, but so have species ranging from beavers to the architect ants whose crenellated towers are visible right now off the port bow. Yes, we weave real fabric things from the dream stuff of mathematics, but the universe is hardwired with arithmetic. Scratch a circle and pi peeps out. Enter a new solar system and Tycho Brahe's formulae lie waiting under the black velvet cloak of space-time. But where has the universe hidden a word under its outer layer of biology, geometry, or insensate rock? Even the traces of other intelligent life we have found, the blimps on Jove 2, the labyrinth builders, the Seneschai empaths on Hebron, the stick people of Dur-Ulis, the architects of the time tombs, hell, the Shrike itself, have left us mysteries and obscure artifacts, but no language, no words. The poet John Keats once wrote to a friend of his named Bailey, "I am certain of nothing but the holiness of his heart's affection and the truth of imagination. What the imagination seizes as beauty must be truth, whether it existed before or not." The Chinese poet George Wu, who died in the last Sino-Japanese War about 3 centuries before the Hegira, understood this when he recorded on his comlog, "Poets are the mad midwives to reality. They see not what it is, nor what can be, but what must become." Later, on his last disc to his lover the week before he died, Wu said, "Words are the only bullets in truth's bandolier, and poets are the snipers." You see, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh in the weave of the human universe. And only the poet can expand this universe, finding shortcuts to new realities the way the Hawken Drive tunnels under the barriers of Einsteinian space-time. To be a poet, I realized, a true poet, was to become the avatar of humanity incarnate. To accept the mantle of poet is to carry the cross of the Son of Man, to suffer the birth pangs of the sole mother of humanity. To be a true poet is to become God. I tried to explain this to my friends on Heaven's Gate. "Piss shit," I said. "Asshole motherfucker. Goddamn shit goddamn. Cunt. Pee-pee cunt. Goddamn." They shook their heads and smiled, and walked away. Great poets are rarely understood in their own day. The yellow-brown clouds rained acid on me. I waded in mud up to my thighs and cleaned leechweed from the city sewer pipes. Old Sludge died during my second year there when we were all working on a project extending the First Avenue Canal to the mid-sump mudflats. An accident. He was climbing a slime dune to rescue a single sulfur rose from the advancing grouter when there was a mudquake. Kitty married shortly after that. She still worked part-time as crib doxy, but I saw less and less of her. She died in childbirth shortly after the green tsunami carried away Mudflat City. I continued to write poetry. How is it, you might ask, that someone can write a fine verse with a vocabulary of only 9 right hemisphere words? The answer is that I used no words at all. Poetry is only secondarily about words. Primarily, it is about truth. I dealt with the Ding an sich, the substance behind the shadow, weaving powerful concepts, similes, and connections the way an engineer would raise a skyscraper with the whiskered alloy skeleton being constructed long before the glass and plastic and chrome aluminum appears. And slowly, words returned. The brain retrains and retools itself amazingly well. What had been lost in the left hemisphere found a home elsewhere, or reasserted their primacy in the damaged regions, like pioneers returning to a fire-damaged plain made more fertile by the flames. Where before a simple word like salt would leave me stuttering and gasping, my mind probing emptiness like a tongue prodding the socket of a missing tooth, now the words and phrases flowed back slowly, like the names of forgotten playmates. During the day I labored in the slime fields, but at night I sat at my splintered table and wrote my cantos by the light of a hissing ghee lamp. Mark Twain once opined in his homey way, "The difference between the right word and the almost right word is the difference between lightning and the lightning bug." He was droll, but incomplete. During those long months of beginning my cantos on Heaven's Gate, I discovered that the difference between finding the right word as opposed to accepting the almost right word was the difference between being struck by lightning and merely watching a lightning display. So my cantos began and grew. Written on the flimsy sheets of recycled leechweed fiber, which they issued by the ton for use as toilet paper, scribbled by one of the cheap felt-tip pens sold at the company store, the cantos took shape. As the words returned, slipping into place like once scattered pieces of a 3D puzzle, I needed a form. Returning to Don Balthazar's teachings, I tried on the measured nobility of Milton's epic verse. Gaining confidence, I added the romantic sensuality of a Byron matured by a Keatsish celebration of language. Stirring all this, I seasoned the mixture with a dash of Yeats's brilliant cynicism and a pinch of Proud's obscure scholastic arrogance. I chopped, diced, and added such ingredients as Eliot's control of imagery, Dylan Thomas's feel for place, Delmore Schwartz's sense of doom, Steve Thames' touch of horror, Salmud Brevi's plea for innocence, Dayton's love of the convoluted rhyme scheme, Wu's worship of the physical, and Edmund Key Ferrara's radical playfulness. In the end, of course, I threw this entire mixture out and wrote the cantos in a style all my own. Oh, thanks for tuning in, Warren Steele. And yes, Wednesday did come on fast. If it had not been for Unc, the slumyard bully, I probably still would be on Heaven's Gate, digging acid canals by day and writing cantos by night. It was my day off, and I was carrying my cantos, the only copy of my manuscript, to the company library in the common hall to do some research, when Unc and two of his cronies appeared from an alley and demanded immediate payment of the next month's protection money. We had no universal cards in the Heaven's Gate atmospheric protectorate. We paid our debts in company scrip or bootleg marks. I had neither. Unc demanded to see what was in my plastic shoulder bag. Without thinking, I refused. It was a mistake. If I'd shown Unc the manuscript, he most probably would have scattered it in the mud and slapped me around after making threats. As it was, my refusal angered him, so he and his two Neanderthal companions tore open the bag, scattered the manuscript in the mud, and beat me within the proverbial inch of my life. It so happened that on this day an EMV belonging to a protectorate air quality control manager was passing low above, and the wife of the manager, traveling alone to the ARC's company residential store, ordered the EMV down, and her android servant retrieved me. had her android servant retrieve me and what was left of my cantos, and then personally drove me to the company hospital. Normally, the members of the bonded workforce received medical aid, if any, at the walk-in bioclinic, but the hospital did not want to refuse the wife of a manager, so I was admitted, still unconscious, and watched over by a human doctor and the manager's wife, while I recovered in a healing tank. All right, to make a banal long story into a banal short story, I'll cut to the uplink. Halenda, that was the manager's wife, read my manuscript while I was floating in renewal nutrient. She liked it. On the same day I was being decanted in the company hospital, Halenda farcast to Renaissance where she showed my cantos to her sister, Philia, who had a friend whose lover knew an editor at Transline Publishing. When I awoke the next day, my broken ribs had been set, my shattered cheekbone had been healed, my bruises were gone, and I'd received 5 new teeth, a new cornea for my left eye, and a contract with Transline. My book came out 5 weeks later. A week after that, Halenda divorced her manager and married me. It was her 7th marriage, my first. We honeymooned on the concourse, and when we returned a month later, my book had sold more than 1 billion copies, the first book of verse to hit the bestseller list in 4 centuries, and I was a millionaire many times over. Tyrena Wingreen Fief. Fief? F-E-I-F. Faith! Tyrena Wingreen Faith was my first editor at Transline. It was her idea to title the book The Dying Earth. A records search showed a novel by that name 500 years earlier, but the copyright had lapsed and the book was out of print. It was her idea to publish just the sections of the cantos which dealt with the nostalgic final days of old Earth. And it was her idea to remove the sections which she thought would bore the readers, the philosophical passages, the descriptions of my mother, the sections which paid homage to earlier poets, the places where I played with their experimental verse, the more personal passages. Everything, in fact, except the descriptions of the idyllic final days which, emptied of all heavier freight, came across as sentimental and insipid. 4 months after publication, The Dying Earth had sold 2.5 billion hardfax copies. An abridged and digitalized version was available on the Sea Thing datasphere, and it had been optioned for the Holies. Tyrena pointed out that the timing had been perfect. The original trauma shock of the death of old Earth had meant a century of denial, almost as if Earth had never existed, followed by a period of revived interest culminating in the old Earth nostalgia cults, which could now be found on every world in the web. A book, even a book of verse, dealing with the final days, had struck at precisely the right moment. For me, the first few months of life as a celebrity in the hegemony were far more disorienting than my earlier transition from spoiled son of old Earth to enslaved stroke victim on Heaven's Gate. During those first months, I did book and fax signing on more than 100 worlds. I appeared on the AllNet Now show with Marm and Hamlet. I met CEO Sinister Perot and the All Things speaker Drury Fane, as well as a score of senators. Sorry. Some of these line breaks are killing me, dude. that my brain is not at 100%, so we're sort of dealing with let's take this paragraph from the top. Sentence from the top. I'm not doing the whole paragraph. During those first months, I did book and fax signing on more than 100 worlds. I appeared on the AllNet Now show with Marm and Hamlet. I met CEO Sinister Perot and the All Things speaker Drury Fane, as well as a score of senators. How did I lose my spot? I'm so sorry. I spoke to the Interplanetary Society of PEN Women and to the Lucis Writers Union. pen women and Lucis Writers Union. I was given honorary degrees at the University of New Earth and at Cambridge, too. I was feted, interviewed, imaged, reviewed favorably, bioed, unauthorized, lionized, serialized, and swindled. It was a busy time. And yo to you, Frank Misers. Thanks for tuning in, all who are. Notes for a sketch of life in the hegemony. My home has 38 rooms on 36 worlds. No doors. The arched entrances are Farcaster portals, a few opaqued with privacy curtains, most open to observation and entry. Each room has windows everywhere and at least 2 walls with portals. From the grand dining hall on Renaissance Vector, I could see the bronze skies and the verdigris towers of Keep Enable in the valley below my volcanic peak, and by turning my head I can look through the Farcaster portal and across the expanse of white carpet in the formal living area to see the Edgar Allan Sea crash against the spires of Point Prospero on Nevermore. My library looks out on the glaciers and green skies of Nordholm, while a walk of 10 paces allows me to descend a short stairway to my tower study, a comfortable, open room encircled by polarized glass which offers a 360-degree view of the highest peaks of the Kushpat Karakoram, a mountain range 2,000 kilometers from the nearest settlement in the easternmost reaches of the Jamnu Republic on Deneb Dry. The huge sleeping room Helenda and I share rocks gently in the boughs of a 300-meter world tree on the Templar world of God's Grove, and connects to a solarium which sits alone on the arid salt flats of Hebron. Not all of our views are of wilderness. The media room opens to a skimmer pad on the 138th floor of a Tau Ceti Center arc tower, and our patio lies on a terrace overlooking the market in the old section of bustling New Jerusalem. The architect, a student of the legendary Milon de Havre, has incorporated several small jokes into the house's design. The steps go down to the tower room, of course, but equally droll is the exit from the Eyrie, which leads to the exercise room on the lowest level of Lucis's deepest hive, or perhaps the guest bathroom, which consists of toilet, bidet, sink, and shower stall on an open, wall-less raft, afloat on the violet sea world of Mare Infinitus. At first, the shifts in gravity from room to room were disturbing, but I soon adapted, subconsciously bracing myself for the drag of Lucis and Hebron and Sol Draconi Septum, unconsciously anticipating the less than 1 standard G freedom of the majority of the rooms. In the 10 standard months Helena and I are together, we spend little time in our home, preferring instead to move with friends among the resorts and vacation arcologies and night spots of the world web. Our friends are the former Farcaster set, now calling themselves the Caribou Herd after an extinct old Earth migratory mammal. This herd consists of other writers, a few successful visual artists, concourse intellectuals, all-thing media representatives, a few radical arnists and cosmetic gene splicers, web aristocrats, wealthy Farcaster freaks and flashback addicts, a few Holy and stage directors, a scattering of actors and performance artists, several mafia dons gone straight, and a revolving list of recent celebrities, myself included. Everyone drinks, uses stims and auto implants, takes the wire, and can afford the best drugs. The drug of choice is flashback. It is definitely an upper class vice. One needs the full range of expensive implants to fully experience it. Helenda has seen to it that I have been so fitted. Biomonitors, sensory extenders, and internal comlog, neural shunts, kickers, metacortex processors, blood chips, RNA tapeworms. My mother wouldn't have recognized my insides. I try flashback twice. The first time is a glide. I target my ninth birthday party and hit it with the first salvo. It is all there. The servants singing on the north lawn at daybreak. Don Balthazar grudgingly canceling classes so I can spend the day with Amalfi in my EMV, streaking across the gray dunes of the Amazon basin in gay abandon. The torchlight procession that evening as representatives of the other old families arrive at dusk, their brightly wrapped presents gleaming under the moon and the 10,000 lights. I rise from 9 hours in flashback with a smile on my face. The second trip almost kills me. I am 4 and crying, seeking my mother through endless rooms smelling of dust and old furniture. Android servants seek to console me, but I shake off their hands, running down hallways soiled with shadows and the soot of too many generations. Breaking the first rule I ever learned, I throw open the doors to Mother's sewing room, her sanctum sanctorum to which she retires for 3 hours every afternoon, and from which she emerges with her soft smile, the hem of her pale dress whispering across the carpet like the echo of a ghost's sigh. Mother is sitting there in the shadows. I am 4, and my finger has been hurt, and I rush to her, throwing myself into her arms. She does not respond. One of her elegant arms remains reclined along the back of the chaise lounge. The other remains limp on the cushion. I pull back, shocked by her cool plasticity. I tug open the heavy velvet drapes without rising from her lap. Mother's eyes are white, rolled back in her head. Her lips are slightly open. Drool moistens the corners of her mouth and glints on her perfect chin. From the gold threads of her hair, done up in the grande dame style she favors, I see the cold steel gleam of the stem wire and the duller sheen of the skull socket she has plugged it into. The patch of bone on either side is very white. On the table near her left hand lies the empty flashback syringe. The servants arrive and pull me away. Mother never blinks. I am pulled screaming from the room. I wake screaming. Perhaps it was my refusal to use flashback again which hastened Helenda's departure, but I doubt it. I was a toy to her, a primitive who amused her by my innocence about a life she had taken for granted for many decades. Whatever the case, my refusal to flashback left me with many days without her. The time spent in replay is real time, and flashback users often die having spent more days of their lives under the drug than they ever experienced conscious. At first, I entertained myself with the implants and techno toys which had been denied to me as a member of an old Earth family. The datasphere was a construct delight that first year. I called up information almost constantly, living in a frenzy of full interface. I was as addicted to raw data as the caribou herd were to their stims and drugs. I could imagine Don Balthazar spinning in his molten grave as I gave up long-term memory for the transient satisfaction of implant omniscience. It was only later that I felt the loss. Fitzgerald's Odyssey, Wu's Final March, and a score of other epics which had survived my stroke now were shredded like cloud fragments in a high wind. Much later, freed of implants, I painstakingly learned them all again. For the first and only time in my life, I became political. Days and nights would pass with me monitoring the Senate or on Farcaster cable, or lying tapped into the All Thing. Someone once estimated that the All Thing deals with about 100 active pieces of hegemony legislation per day, and during my months spent screwed into the sensorium, I missed none of them. My voice and name became well known on the debate channels. No bill was too small, no issue too simple or too complex for my input. The simple act of voting every few minutes gave me a false sense of having accomplished something. I finally gave up the political obsession only after I realized that accessing the all thing regularly meant either staying home or turning into a walking zombie. A person constantly busy accessing on his implants makes a pitiful sight in public, and it didn't take Helenda's derision to make me realize that if I stayed home, I would turn into an all things sponge like so many millions of other slugs around the web. So I gave up politics. But by then, I had found a new passion: religion. I joined religions. Hell, I helped create religions. The Zen Gnostic Church was expanding exponentially, and I became a true believer, appearing on HTV talk shows and searching for my places of power with all of the devoutness of a pre-Hijra Muslim pilgrimaging to Mecca. Besides, I loved farcasting. I had earned almost 100 million marks from royalties for the dying Earth, and Helenda had invested well. But someone once figured that a farcaster home such as mine cost more than 50,000 marks a day just to keep in the web, and I did not limit my farcasting to the 36 worlds of my home. Transline Publishing had qualified me for a gold universal card, and I used it liberally, farcasting to unlikely corners of the web, and then spending weeks staying in luxury accommodations and leasing EMVs to find my places of power in remote areas of backwater worlds. I found none. I renounced Zen Gnosticism about the same time Helenda divorced me. By that time, the bills were piling up, and I had to liquidate most of the stocks and the long-term investments remaining to me after Helenda had taken her share. I was not only naive and in love when she had had her attorneys draw up the marriage contract, I was stupid. Eventually, even with such economies as cutting down my farcasting and dismissing the android servants, I was facing financial disaster. I went to see Tyrena Wingreen Faith. "No one wants to read poetry," she said, leafing through the thin stack of cantos I had written in the past year and a half. "What do you mean?" I said. "The dying earth was poetry." "The dying earth was a fluke," said Tyrena. Her nails were long and green and curved in the latest Mandarin fashion. They curled around my manuscript like the claws of some chlorophyll beast. "It's sold because the mass subconscious was ready for it." "Maybe the mass subconscious is ready for this," I said. I was beginning to get angry. Tyrena laughed. It was not an altogether pleasant sound. "Martin, Martin, Martin," she said. "This is poetry. You're writing about Heaven's Gate and the caribou herd, but what comes across is loneliness, displacement, angst, and a cynical look at humanity." "So?" "So no one wants to pay for a look at another person's angst," laughed Tyrena. I turned away from her desk and walked to the far side of the room. Her office took up the entire 435th floor of the Transline Spire in the Babel section of Tau Ceti Center. There were no windows. The circular room was open from floor to ceiling, shielded by a solar-generated containment field which showed no shimmer whatsoever. It was like standing between two gray plates suspended halfway between the sky and earth. I watched crimson clouds move between the lesser spires half a kilometer below, and I thought about hubris. Tyrena's office had no doorways, stairways, elevators, field lifts, or trap doors. No connection to the other levels at all. One entered Tyrena's office through the five-faceted Farcaster which shimmered in midair like an abstract hollow sculpture. I found myself thinking about tower fires and power failures, as well as hubris. I said, "Are you saying that you won't publish it?" "Not at all. all, smiled my editor. You've earned Transline several billion marks, Martin. We will publish it. All I am saying is that no one will buy it.
You're wrong, I shouted. Not everyone recognizes fine poetry, but there are still enough people who read to make it a bestseller.
Tyrrena did not laugh again, but her smile slashed upward in a twist of green lips. Martin, 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 she said. The population of literate people has been declining steadily since Gutenberg's day. By the 20th century, less than 2% of the people in the so-called industrialized democracies read even one book a year. And that was before the smart machines, data spheres, and user-friendly environments. By the Hedge era, 98% of the hegemony's population had no reason to read anything, so they didn't bother learning how to. It's worse today. There are more than 100 billion human beings in the world web, and less than 1% of them bothers to hardfax any printed material, much less a book. Much less read a book.
The Dying Earth sold almost 3 billion copies, I reminded her.
Mm-hmm, said Tyrrena. It was the Pilgrim's Progress effect.
The what?
The Pilgrim's Progress effect. In the Massachusetts colony of, what was it? 17th century old Earth, every decent family had to have a copy in the household. But, my heavens, no one had to read it. It was the same with Hitler's Mein Kampf or Stukatsky's Visions in the Eye of a Decapitated Child.
Who was Hitler? I said.
Tyrrena smiled slightly. An old Earth politician who did some writing. Mein Kampf is still in print. Transline renews the copyright every 138 years.
Well, look, I said. I'm going to take a few weeks to polish up the cantos and give it my best shot.
Fine, smiled Tyrrena.
I suppose you'll want to edit it the way you did last time?
Not at all, said Tyrrena. Since there's no core of nostalgia this time, you might as well write it the way you want. I blinked.
You mean I can keep the blank verse this time?
Of course.
And the philosophy?
Please do.
And the experimental sections?
Yes.
And you'll print it the way I write it?
Absolutely.
Is there a chance it'll sell?
Not a hope in hell.
My few weeks to polish up the cantos turned into 10 months of obsessive labor. I shut off most of the rooms in the house, keeping only the tower room on Deneb Dry, the exercise room on Lucis, the kitchen, and the bathroom raft on Mare Infinitus. I worked a straight 10 hours a day, took a break for some vigorous exercise, followed by a meal and a nap, and then returned to my writing table for another 8-hour stint. It was similar to the time 5 years before, when I was recovering from my stroke, and it sometimes took an hour a day for a word to come to me, for a concept to sink its roots into the firm soil of language. Now it was an even slower process as I agonized over the perfect word, the precise rhyme scheme, the most playful image, and the most ineffable analog to the most elusive emotion. After 10 standard months, I was done, acknowledging the ancient aphorism to the effect that no book or poem is ever finished, merely abandoned. What do you think? I asked Tyrrena as she read through the first copy. Her eyes were blank, bronze discs in that week's fashion, but this did not hide the fact that there were tears there. She brushed one away. It's beautiful, she said. I tried to rediscover the voice of some of the ancients, I said, suddenly shy. You succeeded brilliantly. The Heaven's Gate interlude is still rough, I said. It's perfect. It's about loneliness, I said. It is loneliness. Do you think it's ready? I asked. It's perfect. A masterpiece. Do you think it'll sell? I asked. No fucking way. They planned an initial run of 70 million hardfax copies of Cantos. Transline ran ads throughout the datasphere, placed HTV commercials, transmitted software inserts, successfully solicited blurbs from best-selling authors, made sure it was reviewed in the new there's two news, New York Times book section, and the TC2 review, and generally spent a fortune on advertising. The Cantos sold 23,000 hardfax copies during the first year it was in print. At 10% royalties of the 12 MK cover price, 12, what is MK? It must be marks. 12 MK cover price, I had earned back 13,800 marks of my 2 million mark advance from Transline. The second year saw a sale of 638 hardfax copies. There were no Datasphere rights sold, no holy options, and no book tours. What the Cantos lacked in sales, it made up for in negative reviews. Indecipherable, archaic, irrelevant to all current concerns, said the Times book section. M. Silenus has committed the ultimate act of non-communication, wrote Urban Capri in the TC2 review, by indulging himself in an orgy of pretentious obfuscation. Marmon Hamlet on AllNet Now issued the final death blow. Oh, the poetry thing from what's his name? Couldn't read it. Didn't try. Yes, the idea of a bathroom on a raft in an ocean planet is literally the best. I love the idea of the wormhole house. It's just so good. It's so good. And it will be copied and it gets borderline plagiarized by Peter F. Hamilton. Honestly, the entire hegemony is basically plagiarized by Peter F. Hamilton at a certain point. It's okay. I don't hold it against him per se, but once you've read this, it's really hard. If you've read him first and then you read this, it's like, oh, that's where literally every good idea he ever had came from. Okay, cool. I'm not saying he's a hack per se, but it gets awful close. Tyrina Wingreen Faith did not seem concerned. 2 weeks after the first reviews and hardfax returns came in, a day after my 13-day binge ended, I farcast to her office and threw myself into the black flow-foam chair which crouched in the center of the room like a velvet panther. One of Tau Ceti Center's legendary thunderstorms was going on, and Jovian-sized lightning crashes were rending the blood-tinged air just beyond the invisible containment field. Don't sweat it, said Tyrina. This week's fashions included a hairdo which sent black spikes thrusting half a meter above her forehead, and a body field opacitor which left shifting currents of color concealing and revealing the nudity beneath. The first run only amounted to 60,000 fax transmits, so we're not out much there. You paid 70 million. You said 70 million were planned, I said. Yeah, well, we changed our minds after Transline's resident AI read it. I slumped lower in the flow foam. Even the AI hated it? The AI loved it, said Tyrina. That's when we knew for sure that people were going to hate it. I sat up. Couldn't we have sold copies to the Technocore? We did, said Tyrina. One. The millions of AIs there probably real-time shared it the minute it came in over Fatline. Interstellar copyright doesn't mean shit when you're dealing with silicon. All right, I said, slumping. What next? Outside, lightning bolts the size of old Earth's ancient superhighways danced between the corporate spires and cloud towers. Tyrina rose from her desk and walked to the edge of the carpeted circle. Her body field flickered like electrically charged oil on water. Next, she said, you decide if you want to be a writer or the World Web's biggest jerk-off. What? You heard me. Tyrina turned and smiled. Her teeth had been capped to gold points. The contract allows us to recover and advance in any way we have to. Seizing your asset at Interbank, recovering the gold coins you've got hidden on Home Free, and selling that gaudy Farcaster house would about do it. And then you can go and join the other artistic dilettantes and dropouts and mental cases that sad King Billy collects on whatever outback world he lives on. I stared. Then again, she said, and smiled her cannibal smile, we can just forget this temporary setback, and you can get to work on your next book. My next book appeared 5 standard months later. The Dying Earth 2 picked up where The Dying Earth left off, in plain prose this time, the sentence length and chapter content carefully guided by neurobiomonitored responses on a test group of 638 average hardfax readers. The book was in novel form, short enough not to intimidate the potential buyer at Food Mart checkout stands, and the cover was a 20-second interactive holo wherein the tall, swarthy stranger, Amalfi Schwartz, I suppose, although Amalfi was short and pale and wore corrective lenses, rips the bodice of the struggling female just to the nipple line before the protesting blonde turns toward the viewer and cries for help in a breathless whisper provided by porn holy star Leda Swan. Dying Earth 2 sold 19 million copies. Not bad, said Tyrina. It takes a while to build an audience. The first Dying Earth sold 3 billion copies, I said. Pilgrim's Progress, she said. Mein Kampf. Once in a century, maybe less. But it sold 3 billion. Look, said Tyrina, in 20th century old Earth, a fast food chain took dead cow meat, fried it in grease, added carcinogens, wrapped it in petroleum-based foam, and sold 900 billion units. Human beings. Go figure. Dying Earth 3 introduced the characters of Winona, the escaped slave girl who rose to the ownership of her own fiber plastic plantation. Never mind that fiber plastic never grew on old Earth. Arturo Redgrave, the dashing blockade runner. What blockade? And Innocence Sperry, the 9-year-old telepath dying of an unspecified Little Nell disease. Innocence lasted until Dying Earth 9, and on the day Transline allowed me to kill the little shit off, I went out to celebrate with a 6-day, 20-world binge. I awoke in a lung pipe on Heaven's Gate, covered with vomit and rebreather mold, nursing the web's biggest headache and the sure knowledge that I soon would have to start on Volume 10 of The Chronicles of the Dying Earth. It isn't hard being a hack writer. Between Dying Earth 2 and Dying Earth 9, 6 standard years had passed relatively painlessly. My research was meager, my plots formulaic, my characters cardboard, my prose pre-literate, and my free time was my own. I traveled. I married twice more. Each wife left me with no hard feelings, but with a sizable portion of the royalties from my next Dying Earth. I explored religions and serious drinking, finding more hope of lasting solace in the latter. I kept my home, adding 6 rooms on 5 worlds, and filled it with fine art. I entertained. Writers were among my acquaintances, but, as in all times, we tended to mistrust and badmouth each other, secretly resenting the other's successes and finding fault in their work. Each of us knew in his or her heart that he or she was a true artist of the word who merely happened to be commercial. The others were hacks. Then, on a cool morning, with my sleeping room rocking slightly in the upper branches of my tree on the Templar world, I awoke to a gray sky and the realization that my muse had fled. It had been 5 years since I had written any poetry. The cantos lay open in the Deneb Dry Tower, only a few pages finished beyond what had been published. I had been using thought processors to write my novels, and one of these activated as I entered the study. Shit, it printed out. What did I do with my muse? It says something about the type of writing I had been doing that my muse could flee without my noticing. For those who do not write and who never have been stirred by the creative urge, talk of muses seems a figure of speech, a quaint conceit. But for those of us who live by the word, our muses are as real and necessary as the soft clay of language which they help to sculpt. When one is writing, really writing, it is as if one is given a fat line to the gods. No true poet has been able to explain the exhilaration one feels when the mind becomes an instrument, as surely as does the pen or thought processor, ordering and expressing the revelations flowing in from somewhere else. My muse had fled. I sought her in the other worlds of my house, but only silence echoed back from the art-bedecked walls and empty spaces. I farcast and flew to my favorite places, watching the suns set on the wind-blown prairies of grass, and the night fogs obscure the ebony crags of Nevermore. But although I emptied my mind of the trash prose of the endless dying earth, there came no whispers from my muse. I sought her in alcohol and flashback, returning to the productive days on Heaven's Gate, when her inspiration was a constant buzzing in my ears, interrupting my work, waking me from sleep. But in the relived hours and days, her voice was as muted and garbled as a damaged audio disc from some forgotten century. My muse had fled. I farcast to Tyrina Wingreen Faith's office at the precise moment of my appointment. Tyrina had been promoted from editor-in-chief of the Hardfax division to publisher. Her new office occupied the highest level of the Tau Ceti Center transline spire, and standing there was like perching on the carpeted summit of the galaxy's tallest, thinnest peak. Only the invisible dome of the slightly polarized containment field arched overhead, and the edge of the carpet ended. What? Only the invisible dome of the slightly polarized containment field arched overhead. Oh, okay, that's where I got it wrong. Only the invisible dome of the slightly polarized containment field arched overhead, and the edge of the carpet ended in a 6-kilometer drop. I wondered if other authors felt the urge to jump. The new opus, said Tyrina. Lucis was dominating the fashion universe this week, and dominate was the right word. My editor was dressed in leather and iron, rusted spikes on her wrist and neck, and a massive bandolier across her shoulder and left breast. The cartridges looked real. Yeah, I said, and tossed the manuscript box on her desk. Martin, she sighed. When are you going to when are you going to transmit your books rather than going to all of the trouble of printing them out and bringing them here in person? There's a strange satisfaction in delivering them, I said, especially this one. Oh? Yes, I said. Why don't you read some of it? Tyrena smiled and clicked black fingernails along the cartridges in her bandolier.
I'm sure it's up to your usual high standards, Martin, she said. I don't have to look at it.
Please do, I said.
Really? Said Tyrena. There's no reason. It always makes me nervous to read a new work while the author is present.
This one won't, I said. Read just the first few pages. She must have heard something in my voice because she frowned slightly and opened the box. The frown deepened as she read the first page and flipped through the rest of the manuscript. Page 1 had a single sentence. And then, one fine morning in October, the dying earth swallowed its own bowels, spasmed its final spasm, and died. The other 299 pages were blank.
A joke, Martin?
Nope.
A subtle hint, then? You would like to begin a new series?
Nope.
It's not as if we hadn't expected it, Martin. Our storyliners have come up with several exciting series ideas for you. Oh my god. M. Subwazy thinks that you would be perfect for the novelizations of the Crimson Avenger holies.
You can stick the Crimson Avenger up your corporate ass, Tyrena, I said cordially. I'm finished with Transline and this pre-masticated gruel you call fiction. Tyrena's expression did not flicker. Her teeth were not pointed. Today they were rusted iron to match the spikes on her wrist and the collar around her neck.
Martin, 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 she sighed. You have no idea how finished you will be if you don't apologize, straighten up, and fly right. But that can wait until tomorrow. Why don't you step home, sober up, and think about this?
I laughed. I'm as sober as I've been in 8 years, lady. It just took me a while to realize that it wasn't just me who's writing crap. There's not a book published in the web this year that hasn't been total garbage. Well, I'm getting off the scow. Tyrena rose. For the first time, I noticed that on her simulated canvas web belt, there hung a Force death wand. I hoped that it was as designer fake as the rest of her costume.
Listen, you miserable no-talent hack, she hissed. Transline owns you from the balls up. If you give us any more trouble, we'll have you working for the Gothic Romance Factory under the name Rosemary Titmouse. Now go home, sober up, and get to work on Dying Earth 10.
I smiled and shook my head. Tyrena squinted slightly.
You're still into us for almost a million-mark advance, she said. One word to collections and we'll seize every room of your house except that goddamn raft you use as an outhouse. You can sit on it until the oceans fill up with crap.
I laughed a final time. It's a self-contained disposal unit, I said. Besides, I sold the house yesterday. The check for the balance of the advance should have been transmitted by now. Tyrena tapped the plastic grip of her death wand.
Transline's copyrighted the Dying Earth concept, you know. We'll just have someone else write the books.
I nodded. They're welcome to it. Something in my ex-editor's voice changed when she realized that I was serious. Somewhere, I sensed, there was an advantage to her if I stayed.
Listen, she said, I'm sure that we can work this out, Martin. I was saying to the director the other day that your advances were too small and that Transline should let you develop a new storyline.
Tyrena, I sighed. Goodbye. I farcast to Renaissance Vector, and then to Parsimony, where I boarded a spin ship for the 3-week voyage to Asquith and the crowded kingdom of Sad King Billy. And just give me 1 sec here.
Sorry about that. Alrighty, where were we? Here we go.
Notes for a sketch of sad King Billy. His Royal Highness King William the 23rd, Sovereign Lord of the Kingdom of Windsor in exile, looks a bit like a wax candle of a man who has been left on a hot stove. His long hair runs in limp rivulets to slumped shoulders, while the furrows on his brow trickle downward to the tributaries of wrinkles around the basset hound eyes, and then run southward again through folds and frown lines to the maze of wattles and neck and jowls. King Billy is said to remind anthropologists of the Wari dolls of the outback Kinshasa, to make Zen Gnostics recall the pitiful Buddha after the temple fire on Taijin, and to send media historians rushing to their archives to check photos of an ancient flat film movie actor named Charles Lawton. None of these references mean anything to me. I look at King Billy and I think of my long-dead tutor Don Balthazar after a week-long binge. Sad King Billy's reputation for gloominess is exaggerated. He often laughs. It is merely his misfortune that his particular form of laughter makes most people think he is sobbing. A man cannot help his physiognomy, but in His Highness's case, the entire persona tends to suggest either buffoon or victim. He dresses, if that can be the word, in something approaching a constant state of anarchy, defying the taste and color sense of his android servants, so that on some days he clashes with himself and his environment simultaneously. Nor is his appearance limited to sartorial chaos. King William moves in a permanent sphere of dishabille, his fly unsealed, his velvet cape torn and tattered, and drawing crumbs magnetically from the floor, his left sleeve ruffled twice as long as the right, which, in turn, looks as if it has been dipped in jam. You get the idea. For all this, sad King Billy has an insightful mind and a passion for the arts and literature which has not been equaled since the true Renaissance days on old Earth. In some ways, King Billy is the fat child with his face eternally pressed to the candy store window. He loves and appreciates fine music, but cannot produce it. A connoisseur of ballet and all things graceful, His Highness is a klutz, a moving series of pratfalls and comic bits of clumsiness. A passionate reader, unerring poetry critic, and patron of forensics, King Billy combines a stutter in his verbal expression with a shyness which will not allow him to show his verse or prose to anyone else. A lifelong bachelor, now entering his 60th year, King Billy inhabits the tumble-down palace and 2,000-square-mile kingdom as if it were another suit of rumpled royal clothes. Anecdotes abound. One of the famous oil painters whom King Billy supports finds His Majesty walking head down, hands clasped behind him, one foot on the garden path and one in the mud, obviously lost in thought. The artist hails his patron. Sad King Billy looks up, blinks, looks round as if awaking from a long nap.
Excuse me,
His Highness says to the bemused painter,
but could you please tell me, was I headed toward the palace or away from the palace?
Toward the palace, your majesty, replies the artist.
Oh, good, sighs the king. Then I've had lunch.
General Horace Glennon Height had begun his rebellion, and the outback world of Asquith lay directly in his path of conquest. Asquith was not worried. The hegemony had offered a force space fleet as a shield. But the royal ruler of the kingdom of Monaco in exile seemed more melted than ever when he called me in.
Martin, said His Majesty, you heard about the battle for Fomalhaut?
Yes, I said. It doesn't sound like anything to worry about. Formalhaut was just the kind of place Glennon Heights been hitting. Small, no more than a few thousand colonists, rich in minerals, and with a time debt of at least, what was it, 20 standard months from the web.
23,
said Sad King Billy.
So you don't think that we are in jeopardy?
I said. With only a 3-week real transit time and a time debt of less than a year, the hegemony can always get forces here from the web faster than the general can spin up from Formalhaut.
Perhaps,
mused King Billy, beginning to lean on a globe and then jumping upright as it started to turn under his weight.
But nonetheless I've decided to start our own modest hegira.
I blinked, surprised. Billy had been talking about relocating the kingdom in exile for almost 2 years, but I had never thought he would go through with it.
The ships are ready on Parvati, he said. Asquith has agreed to provide the transport we need to the web.
But the palace? I said. The library? The farms and grounds?
Donated, of course,
said King Billy.
But the contents of the library will travel with us.
I sat on the arm of the horse-haired divan and rubbed my cheek. In the 10 years I had been in the kingdom, I had progressed from Billy's subject of patronage to tutor, to confidant, to friend, but never did I pretend to understand this disheveled enigma. Upon my arrival, he had granted me an immediate audience.
Do you wish to join the other talented people in our little colony?
He had asked. Yes, Your Majesty.
And will you write more books like the Dying Earth?
Not if I can help it, Your Majesty.
I read it, you know,
the little man had said.
It was very interesting.
You're most kind, sir.
Bullshit, Silenus. It was interesting because someone had obviously bowdlerized it and left in all the bad parts.
I had grinned, surprised by the sudden revelation that I was going to like Sad King Billy.
But the cantos, he sighed. That was a book. Probably the finest volume of poetry published in the web in the last 2 centuries. How you managed to get that by the mediocrity police, I will never know. I ordered 20,000 copies for the kingdom. For the kingdom.
I bowed my head slightly, at a loss for words for the first time since my post-stroke days 2 decades before. So, as a quick little reminder of how many copies got purchased, we're just flipping back here a sec. Nope, that's Dying Earth 2. So King Billy bought 20,000 copies. 20,000? Did I read that correctly? 20,000. Come on, where are you? Wrong page. I ordered 20,000 copies for the kingdom. So, they planned an initial run of 70 million hardfax copies. The Cantos sold 23,000 hardfax copies during the first year it was in print, plus another 300 or something. 638 copies afterwards the next year. So Sad King Billy is the sole purchaser of almost every single copy of the one book that this guy is proud of, ever. So, this... There.
I ordered 20,000 copies for the kingdom.
I bowed my head slightly, at a loss for words for the first time since my post-stroke days 2 decades before.
Will you write more poetry like the cantos?
I came here to try, Your Majesty.
Then welcome,
said sad King Billy.
You'll stay in the west wing of the castle near my offices, and my door will always be open to you.
Now I glanced at the closed door and at the little sovereign who, even when smiling, looked as if he were on the verge of tears. Hyperion? I asked. He had mentioned the colony world gone primitive many times.
Precisely. The android seed ships have been there for some years, Martin, preparing the way, as it were. Preparing the way, as it were.
I raised an eyebrow. King Billy's wealth came not from the assets of the kingdom, but from major investments in the web economy. Even so, if he had been carrying on a surreptitious recolonization effort for years, the cost must have been staggering.
Do you remember why the original colonists named the world Hyperion, Martin?
Sure. Before the Hedge era, they were a tiny little freehold on one of the moons of Saturn. They couldn't last without terrestrial resupply, so they emigrated to the outback and named the survey world after their moon. King Billy smiled sadly.
And do you know why the name is propitious for our endeavor?
It took me about 10 seconds to make the connection. Keats, I said. Several years earlier, near the end of a long discussion about the essence of poetry, King Billy had asked me who was the purest poet who had ever lived. The purest? I had said. Don't you mean the greatest?
No, no, said Billy. That's absurd to argue over who is the greatest. I'm curious about your opinion of the purest, the closest to the essence you describe.
I had thought about it a few days and then brought my answer to King Billy as we watched the setting suns from the top of the bluff near the palace. Red and blue shadows stretched across the amber lawn toward us. Keats, I said.
John Keats,
whispered sad King Billy. whispered sad King Billy.
Ah.
And then a moment later,
why?
So I had told him what I knew about the 19th century old earth poet, about his upbringing, training, and early death, but mostly about a life dedicated almost totally to the mysteries and beauties of poetic creation. Billy had seemed interested then. He seemed obsessed now as he waved his hand and brought into existence a hollow model which all but filled the room. I moved backwards, stepping through hills and buildings and grazing animals to get a better view.
Behold Hyperion,
whispered my patron. As was usually the case when he was totally absorbed, King Billy forgot to stutter. The hollow shifted through a series of views. River cities, port cities, mountain eyries, a city on a hill filled with monuments to match the strange buildings in the nearby valley. The time tombs? I said.
Precisely. The greatest mystery in the known universe.
I frowned at the hyperbole. They're fucking empty, I said. They've been empty since they were discovered.
They are the source of a strange anti-entropic force field which lingers still,
said King Billy.
One of the few phenomena outside singularities which dares to tamper with time itself.
It's no big deal, I said. It must have been like painting rust. It must have been like painting rust preventative on metal. They were made to last, but they're empty. And since when do we go bug fuck about technology?
Not technology,
sighed King Billy, his face melting into deeper grooves.
Mystery. The strangeness of place so necessary to some creative spirits. A perfect mixture of the classical utopia and the pagan mystery.
I shrugged, not impressed. Sad King Billy waved the hollow away.
Has your poetry improved?
I crossed my arms and glared at the regal dwarf slob. No.
Has your muse returned?
I said nothing. If looks could have killed, we would all be crying, "The king is dead! Long live the king!" before nightfall.
Very well,
He said, showing that he could look insufferably smug as well as sad.
Pack your bags, my boy. We're going to Hyperion.
Fade in. Sad King Billy's 5 siege ships floating like golden dandelions above a lapis sky. White cities rising on 3 continents. Keats, Endymion, Port Romance. The poet's city itself. More than 8,000 of art's pilgrims seeking escape from the tyranny of mediocrity and searching for a renewal of vision in this rough-hewn world. Asquith and Windsor in Exile had been a center for android biofacture in the century following the Hegira, and now these blue-skinned friends of man labored and tilled with the understanding that once these final labors were finished, they were free at last. The white cities rose. The indigenes, tired of playing native, came out of their villages and forests and helped us rebuild the colony to more human specifications. The technocrats and bureaucrats and ecocrats were thawed and let loose upon the unsuspecting world, and Sad King Billy's dream came one step closer to reality. By the time we arrived at Hyperion, General Horace Glenenheit was dead, his brief but brutal mutiny already crushed, but there was no turning back. Some of the more rugged artists and artisans spurned the poet's city and eked out rugged but creative lives in Jacktown or Port Romance, or even in the expanding frontiers beyond. But I stayed. I found no muse on Hyperion during those first years. For many, the expansion of distance because of limited transportation, EMVs were unreliable, skimmers scarce, and the contraction of artificial consciousness due to the absence of datasphere, no access to the all-thing, and only one fatline transmitter, all led to a renewal of creative energies, a new realization of what it meant to be human and an artist. Or so I heard. No muse appeared. My verse continued to be technically proficient and dead as Huck Finn's cat. I decided to kill myself. But first I spent some time, 9 years at least, carrying out a community service by providing the one thing New Hyperion lacked: decadence. From a biosculptor aptly named Grauman Hackett, I obtained the hairy flanks, hooves, and goat legs of a satyr. I cultivated my beard and extended my ears. Grauman made interesting alterations to my sexual apparatus. Word got around. Peasant girls, indigenes, the wives of our true blue city planners and pioneers, all awaited a visit from Hyperion's only resident satyr, or arranged one themselves. I learned what priapic and satyriasis really mean. Besides the unending series of sexual contests, I allowed my drinking bouts to become legendary, and my vocabulary to return to something approaching the old post-stroke days. It was fucking wonderful. It was fucking hell. And then, on the night I had set aside to blow my brains out, Grendel appeared.
Oh, thank you for tuning in, Mulo Spult. I'm sorry if I'm mangling that. Frag, would you consider reading Ilium by Dan Simmons? Yes, I would consider reading Ilium by Dan Simmons. I just have to get a copy. Or did I already do that? I bought a bunch of Dan Simmons stuff. not too long ago when someone asked me to read, I think it was Carrion Comfort, which I'll get to. If I'm lucky this year, maybe. I've got other things to read, like the rest of Hyperion. So I will add that to the docket if I have not grabbed Ilium yet. I have a backlog of things I need to read a mile long. Some of which are books that feel like they're probably a mile long. And my free time hasn't been entirely my own of late. So we will, yes, I will strongly consider reading. If you're asking for Ilium, I'll read it.
Notes for a sketch of our visiting monster. Our worst dreams have come alive. Something wicked shuns the light. Shades of Morbius and the Krell. Keep the fires high, mother. Grendel comes tonight. At first, we think the missing are merely absent. There are no watchers on the walls of our city. No walls, actually. No warriors at the door of our mead hall. Then a husband reports a wife who disappears between the evening meal and the tucking in of their 2 children. Then Hoban Christus, the abstract implosionist, fails to appear at midweek performance at Poets Amphitheater, his first missed cue in 82 years of treading the boards. Concern rises. Sad King Billy returns from his labors as overseer on the Jacktown restoration and promises that security will be tightened. A censor net is woven around the town. Ship security officers sweep the time tombs and report that all remains empty. Mechs are sent into the labyrinth entrance at the base of the Jade Tomb and report nothing in a 6,000-kilometer probe. Skimmers, automated and manned, sweep the area between the city and the bridle range and sense nothing larger than the heat signature of a rock eel. For a local week, there are no more disappearances. Then the deaths begin. The sculptor Pete Garcia is found in his studio, and in his bedroom, and in the yard beyond. Ship security manager Truin Hines is foolish enough to tell a news teep, "It's like he was mauled by some vicious animal, but no animal I've ever seen could do that to a man." We are all secretly thrilled and titillated. True, the dialogue is bad, straight out of a million movies and holies we've scared ourselves with, but now we are part of the show. Suspicion turns toward the obvious. A psychopath is loose among us, probably killing with a pulse blade or hell whip. This time he, or she, has not found time to dispose of the body. Poor Pete. Ship security manager Hines is sacked, and city manager Pruitt receives permission from His Majesty to hire, train, and arm a city police force of approximately 20 officers. There is talk of truth testing the entire Poet City population of 6,000. Sidewalk cafes buzz with conversation of civil rights. Were we technically out of the hegemony? Did we have any rights? And harebrained schemes are hatched to catch the murderer. Then the slaughter begins. There was no pattern to the murders. Bodies were found in 2s and 3s, or alone, or not at all. Some of the disappearances were bloodless. Others left gallons of gore. There were no witnesses, no survivors of attacks. Location did not seem to matter. The Wymont family lived in one of the outlying villas, but Syra Robb never stirred from her tower studio near the center of town. 2 of the victims disappeared alone, at night, apparently while walking in the Zen garden. But Chancellor Lehman's daughter had private bodyguards, yet vanished while alone in a bathroom on the 7th floor of Sad King Billy's palace. On Lucis or Tau Ceti Center, or a dozen other of the old web worlds, the deaths of 1,000 people add up to minor news. Items for Datasphere short term or the inside pages of the morning paper. But in a city of 6,000, on a colony of 50,000, a dozen murders, like the proverbial sentence to be hanged in the morning, tend to focus one's attention wonderfully well. I knew one of the first victims. Sisyphus Harris had been one of my first conquests as a satyr, and one of my most enthusiastic. A beautiful girl, long blonde hair, too soft to be real, a fresh-picked peach complexion, too virginal to dream of touching, a beauty too perfect to believe, precisely the sort that even the most timid male dreams of violating. Sisyphus now had been violated in earnest. They found only her head, lying upright in the center of Lord Byron's plaza as if she had been buried to her neck in pourable marble. I knew when I heard these details precisely what kind of creature we were dealing with, for a cat I had owned on Mother's estate had left similar offerings on the south patio most summer mornings. The head of a mouse staring up from the sandstone in pure rodent amazement, or perhaps a ground squirrel's toothy grin. Killing trophies from a proud but hungry predator. Sad King Billy came to visit me while I was working on my cantos. "Good morning, Billy," I said.
It's your majesty.
Grumped his majesty, in a rare show of royal pique. His stutter had disappeared the day the royal dropship landed on Hyperion. "Good morning, Billy, your majesty," growled my liege lord, moving some papers and managing to sit in the only puddle of spilled coffee on an otherwise dry bench.
You're writing again, Silenus?
I saw no reason to acknowledge an acknowledgment of the obvious.
Have you always used a pen?
"No," I said, "only when I want to write something worth reading."
Is that worth reading?
He gestured toward the small heap of manuscript I had accrued in 2 local weeks of work. "Yes."
Yes? Just yes?
"Yes."
Will I get to read it soon?
"No." King Billy looked down and noticed that his left leg was in a puddle of coffee. He frowned, moved, and mopped at the shrinking pool with the hem of his cape.
Never?
He said, "Not unless you outlive me,"
Which I plan to do,
said the king.
while you expire from playing goat to the kingdom's ewes.
"Is that an attempt at a metaphor?"
Not in the least, said King Billy. Merely an observation.
"I haven't forced my attentions on a ewe since my boyhood days on the farm," I said. "I promised my mother in song that I wouldn't indulge in sheep fucking again without asking her permission. While King Billy looked on mournfully, I sang a few bars of an ancient ditty called "There'll Never Be Another You."
Martin, he said, someone or something is killing my people.
I set aside my paper and pen. "I know," I said.
I need your help.
"How, for Christ's sake? How am I supposed to track down the killer like some HTV detective? Have a fight to the fucking death on Reichenbach fucking Falls?"
That would be satisfactory, Martin, but in the meantime a few opinions and words of advice would suffice.
"Opinion 1," I said, "it was stupid to come here. Opinion 2, it's stupid to stay. Advice Alpha Omega, leave." King Billy nodded dolefully.
Leave this city or all of Hyperion?
I shrugged. His Majesty rose and walked to the window of my small study. It looked out across a 3-meter alley to the brick wall of the automated recycling plant next door. King Billy studied the view.
You're aware, he said, of the ancient legend of the Shrike?
"I've heard bits of it."
The Indigenes associate the monster with the time tombs, he said.
"The Indigenes smear paint on their bellies for the harvest celebration and smoke unrecombinant tobacco," I said. King Billy nodded at the wisdom of this. he said.
The hegemony first down team was wary of this area. They set up the multi-channel recorders and kept their bases south of the bridle.
Look, I said, Your Majesty, what do you want? Absolution for screwing up and building the city here? You're absolved. Go and sin no more, my son. Now, if you don't mind, your royalship, adios. I've got dirty limericks to write here. King Billy did not turn away from the window.
You recommend that we evacuate the city, Martin?
I hesitated only a second. Sure.
And what would you leave? And would you leave with the rest?
Why wouldn't I? King Billy turned and looked me in the eye.
Would you?
I said nothing. After a minute, I looked away.
I thought so,
said the ruler of the planet. He clasped his pudgy hands behind his back and stared at the wall again.
If I were a detective, he said, I would be suspicious. The city's least productive citizen starts writing again after a decade of silence only, what, Martin, 2 days after the first murders happened? Now he's disappeared from the social life he once dominated and spends his time composing an epic poem. Shy, even the young girls are safe from his goatish ardor.
I sighed. Goatish ardor, my lord? King Billy glanced over his shoulder at me.
All right,
I said. You've got me. I confess. I've been murdering them and bathing in their blood. It works as a fucking literary aphrodisiac. I figure 300 more victims tops, and I'll have my next book ready for publication. King Billy turned back to the window. What's the matter? I said. Don't you believe me?
No.
Why not?
Because,
said the king,
I know who the murderer is.
We sat in the darkened hollow pit and watched the Shrike kill novelist Syra Robb and her lover. The light level was very low. Syra's middle-aged flesh seemed to glow with a pale phosphorescence, while her much younger boyfriend's white buttocks gave the illusion in the dim light of floating separately from the rest of his tanned body. Their love-making was reaching its frenzied peak when the inexplicable occurred. Rather than the final thrusts and sudden pause of orgasm, the young man seemed to levitate up and backward, rising into the air as if Syra had somehow forcefully ejected him from her body. The soundtrack on the disc, previously consisting of the usual banal pants, gasps, exhortations, and instructions one would expect from such activity, suddenly filled the hollow pit with screams. First the young man's, then Syra's. There was a thud as the boy's body struck a wall off camera. Syra's body lay waiting in tragically comic vulnerability, her legs wide, arms open, breasts flattened, thighs pale. Her head had been thrown back in ecstasy, but now she had time to raise it, shock and anger already replacing the oddly similar expression of imminent orgasm. She opened her mouth to shout something. No words. There came the watermelon carving sound of blades piercing flesh, of hooks being pulled free of tendon and bone. Syra's head went back, her mouth opened impossibly wide, and her body exploded from the breastbone down. Flesh separated as if an invisible axe were chopping Syra Robb for kindling. Unseen scalpels completed the job of opening her, lateral incisions appearing like obscene time-lapse footage of a mad surgeon's favorite operation. It was a brutal autopsy performed on a living person. On a once living person, rather, for when the blood stopped flying and the body ceased spasming, Syra's limbs relaxed in death, legs opening again in an echo of the obscene display of viscera above. And then, for the briefest second, there was a blur of red and chrome near the bed.
Freeze, expand, and augment,
King Billy told the house computer. The blur resolved itself into a head out of a jolt addict's nightmare. A face part steel, part chrome, and part skull. Teeth like a mechanized wolf's crossed with a steam shovel. Eyes like ruby lasers burning through blood-filled gems. Forehead penetrated by a curved spike blade rising 30 centimeters from a quicksilver skull. And a neck ringed with similar thorns. "The Shrike?" I asked. King Billy nodded, the merest movement of chin and jowls. "What happened to the boy?" I asked.
"There was no sign of him when Syra's body was discovered,"
said the king.
"No one knew he was missing until this disc was discovered. He has been identified as a young recreation specialist from Endymion."
"You just found the hollow?"
"Yesterday," said King Billy. "The security people found the imager on the ceiling, less than a millimeter across. Syra had a library of such discs. The camera apparently was there only to record
"The bedroom follies," I said.
precisely."
I stood up and approached the floating image of the creature. My hand passed through forehead, spike, and jaws. The computer had calculated its size and represented it properly. Judging from the thing's head, our local Grendel stood more than 3 meters tall. "Shrike," I muttered, more in greeting than in identification.
"What can you tell me about it, Martin?"
"Why ask me?" I snapped. "I'm a poet, not a mythohistorian."
"You accessed the seed ship computer with a query about the Shrike's nature and origins."
I raised an eyebrow. Computer access was supposed to be as private and anonymous as datasphere entry in the hegemony. "So what?" I said. "Hundreds of people must have checked out the Shrike legend since the killings began. Maybe thousands. It's the only fucking monster legend we've got." King Billy moved his wrinkles and folds up and down.
"Yes," he said, "but you searched the files 3 months before the first disappearance."
I sighed and slumped into the hollow pit cushions. "All right," I said. "I did. So what? I wanted to reuse the fucking legend in the fucking poem I'm writing, so I researched it. Arrest me."
"What did you learn?"
I was very angry now. I stamped satyr hooves into the soft carpet. "Just the stuff in the fucking file!" I snapped. "What in the hell do you want from me, King Bill? What in the hell do you want from me, Billy?" The king rubbed his brow and winced as he accidentally stuck his little finger in his eye.
"I don't know," he said. "The security people wanted to take you up to the ship and put you on full interrogative interface. I chose to talk to you instead."
I blinked, feeling a strange zero-G sensation in my stomach. Full interrogative meant cortical shunts and sockets in the skull. Most people interrogated that way recovered fully. Most.
"Can you tell me what aspect of the Shrike legend you planned to use in your poem?"
King Billy asked softly. "Sure," I said. "According to the Shrike cult gospel that the Indigenes started, the Shrike is the Lord of Pain and the Angel of Final Atonement, come from a place beyond time to announce the end of the human race. I like that conceit."
"The end of the human race,"
repeated King Billy. Yeah, he's Michael the Archangel and Moroni and Satan and masked entropy and the Frankenstein monster all rolled into one package, I said. He hangs around the time tombs, waiting to come out and wreak havoc when it's mankind's time to join the dodo and the gorilla and the sperm whale on the extinction hit parade list.
The Frankenstein monster,
Mused the short little fat man in the wrinkled cape.
why him?
I took a breath. Because the Shrike cult believes that mankind somehow created the thing, I said, although I knew that King Billy knew everything I knew and more.
Do they know how to kill it?
He asked. Not that I know of. He's supposed to be immortal, beyond time.
A god?
I hesitated. Not really, I said at last. More like one of the universe's worst nightmares come to life. Sort of like the Grim Reaper, but with a penchant for sticking souls on a giant thorn tree, while people's souls are still in their bodies. King Billy nodded. Look, I said, if you insist on splitting hairs from backworld theologies, why don't you fly down to Jacktown and ask a few of the cult priests?
Yes,
said the king, chin on his pudgy fist, obviously distracted.
They're already on the seed ship being interrogated. It's all most confusing.
I rose to leave, not sure if I would be allowed to.
Martin?
Yeah?
Before you go, can you think of anything else that could help us understand this thing?
I paused in the doorway, feeling my heart batting at my ribs to get out. Yeah, I said, my voice only marginally steady. I could tell you who and what the Shrike really is.
Oh?
It's my muse, I said, and turned, and went back to my room to write. Of course I had summoned the Shrike. I knew that. I had summoned it by beginning my epic poem about it. In the beginning was the Word. In the beginning was the Word. I retitled my poem The Hyperion Cantos. It was not about the planet, but about the passing of the self-styled titans called humans. It was about the unthinking hubris of a race which dared to murder its homeworld through sheer carelessness, and then carried that dangerous arrogance to the stars, only to meet the wrath of a god which humanity had helped to sire. Hyperion was the first serious work I had done in many years, and it was the best I would ever do. What began as a comic serious homage to the ghost of John Keats became my last reason for existence, an epic tour de force in an age of mediocre farce. Hyperion Cantos was written with a skill I could never have attained, with a mastery I could never have gained, and sung in a voice which was not mine. The passing of humankind was my topic. The Shrike was my muse. A score more people died before King Billy evacuated the city of poets. Some of the evacuees went to Endymion or Keats or one of the other new cities, but most voted to take the seed ships back to the web. King Billy's dream of a creative utopia died, although the king himself lived on in the gloomy palace at Keats. Leadership of the colony passed to the Home Rule Council, which petitioned the hegemony for membership and immediately established a self-defense force. The SDF, made up primarily of the same indigenes who had been cudgeling each other a decade before, but commanded now by self-styled officers from our new colony, succeeded only in disturbing the peacefulness of the night with their automated skimmer patrols and marring the beauty of the returning desert with their mobile surveillance mechs. Surprisingly, I was not the only one to stay behind. At least 200 remained, although most of us avoided social contact, smiling politely when we passed on Poet's Walk, or while we ate apart in the echoing emptiness of the dining dome. The murders and disappearances continued, averaging about one a local fortnight, although they were usually discovered not by us but by the regional SDF commander, who demanded a head count of citizens every few weeks. The image that remains in my mind from that first year is an unusually communal one. The night we gathered on the commons to watch the siege ship leave. It was at the height of the autumn meteor season, and Hyperion's night skies were already ablaze with gold streaks and red crisscrosses of flame when the siege ship's engines fired. A small sun flared, and for an hour we watched as friends and fellow artists receded as a streak of fusion flame. Sad King Billy joined us that night, and I remember that he looked at me before he solemnly re-entered his ornate coach to return to the safety of Keats. In the dozen years which followed, I left the city only half a dozen times. Once to find a biosculptor who could rid me of my satyr affectations, the other times to buy food and supplies. The Shrike Temple had renewed the Shrike pilgrimages by this time, and on my trips I would use their elaborate avenue to death in reverse. The walk to Kronos Keep, the aerial tram across the bridle range, the wind wagons, and the Charon barge down the Hooghly. Coming back, I would stare at the pilgrims and wonder who would survive. Few visited the city of poets. Our half-finished towers began to look like tumbled ruins. The gallerias, with their splendid metal glass domes and covered arcades, grew heavy with vines. Pireweed and scargrass poked up between the flagstones. The SDF added to the chaos, setting mines and booby traps to kill the Shrike, but only succeeding in devastating once beautiful sections of the city. Irrigation broke down. The aqueduct collapsed. The desert encroached. I moved from room to room in King Billy's abandoned palace, working on my poem, waiting for my muse. When you think about it, the cause-effect begins to resemble some mad logic loop by the data artist Carolus, or perhaps a print by Escher. The Shrike had come into existence because of the incantatory powers of my poem, but the poem could not have existed without the threat/presence of the Shrike as a muse. Perhaps I was a bit mad in those days. In a dozen years, sudden death culled the city of dilettantes until only the Shrike and I remained. The annual passage of the Shrike pilgrimage was a minor irritation, a distant caravan crossing the desert to the time tombs. Sometimes a few figures returned, fleeing across Vermilion sands to the refuge of Kronos Keep, 20 kilometers to the southwest. More often, no one emerged. I watched from the shadows of the city. My hair and beard had grown until they covered some of the rags I wore. I came out mostly at night, moving through the ruins like a furtive shadow, sometimes gazing at my lighted palace tower like David Hume peering in his own windows and solemnly deciding that he wasn't home. I never moved the food synthesizer from the dining dome to my apartments, preferring instead to eat in the echoing silence under that cracked Duomo like some addled Eloi fattening himself up for the inevitable Morlock. Like some addled Eloi fattening himself up for the inevitable Morlock. I never saw the Shrike. Many nights, just before dawn, I would awaken from a nap at a sudden sound, the scratch of metal on stone, the rasp of sand under something's foot. But although I was often sure that I was being watched, I never saw the watcher. Occasionally I made the short trip to the time tombs, especially at night, avoiding the soft, disconcerting tugs of the anti-entropic time tides while I moved through complicated shadows under the wings of the Sphinx, or stared at stars through the emerald wall of the jade tomb. It was upon my return from one of these nocturnal pilgrimages that I found an intruder in my study.
Impressive, Martin,
said King Billy, tapping one of several heaps of manuscript which lay about the room. Seated in the oversized chair at the long table, the failed monarch looked old, more melted than ever. It was obvious that he had been reading for several hours.
Do you really think that mankind deserves such an end?
He asked softly. It had been a dozen years since I had heard the stutter. I moved away from the door, but did not answer. Billy had been a friend and a patron for more than 20 standard years, but at that moment I could have killed him. The thought of someone reading Hyperion without permission filled me with rage.
You date your cantos?
Said King Billy, rifling through the most recent stack of completed pages. How did you get here? I snapped. It was not an idle question. Skimmers, dropships, and helicopters had not had much luck flying to the Time Tombs region in recent years. The machines arrived sans passengers. It had done wonders in fueling the Shrike myth. The little man in the rumpled cape shrugged. His uniform was meant to be brilliant and regal, but merely made him look like an overweight harlequin.
I followed the last batch of pilgrims, he said, and then came down from Keep Kronos to visit. I noticed that you've written nothing in many months, Martin. Can you explain that?
I glowered in silence while sidling closer.
Perhaps I can explain it,
said King Billy. He looked at the last completed page of Hyperion cantos as if it had the answer to a long puzzled riddle.
The last stanzas were written the same week last year that J.T. Telio disappeared.
So? I had moved to the far edge of the table now. Feigning a casual attitude, I pulled a short stack of manuscript pages closer and moved them out of Billy's reach.
So that was, according to the SDF monitors, the date of the death of the last remaining poet city dweller,
he said.
The last except for you, that is, Martin.
I shrugged and began moving around the table. I needed to get to Billy without getting the manuscript in the way.
You know, you haven't finished it, Martin, he said in a deep, sad voice. There is still some chance that humanity survives the fall.
No, I said, and sidled closer.
But you can't write it, can you, Martin? You can't compose this poetry unless your muse is shedding blood, can you?
Bullshit, I said.
Perhaps, but a fascinating coincidence. Have you ever wondered why you have been spared, Martin?
I shrugged again and slid another stack of papers out of his reach. I was taller, stronger, and meaner than Billy, but I had to be sure that none of the manuscript would be damaged if he struggled as I lifted him out of his seat and threw him out.
It's time that we did something about this problem,
said my patron. No, I said. It's time you left. I shoved the last stacks of poetry aside and raised my arms, surprised to see a brass candlestick in one hand.
Stop right there, please,
King Billy said softly, and lifted a neural stunner from his lap. I paused only a second. Then I laughed. You miserable little hangdog fraud, I said. You couldn't use a fucking weapon if your life depended on it. I stepped forward to beat him up and throw him out. My cheek was against the stone of the courtyard, but one eye was open enough for me to see that the stars still shone through the broken latticework of the Galleria dome. I could not blink. My limbs and torso tingled with the pinpricks of returning sensation, as if my entire body had fallen asleep and was now coming painfully awake. It made me want to scream, but my jaw and tongue refused to work. Suddenly I was lifted and propped against a stone bench so that I could see the courtyard and the dry fountain which Rithmit Corbett had designed. The bronze Laucoan, I have no idea how that's pronounced. Laoco umlaut O-N. Laucoan? Lauco... How's it? Laucoan. Laucoan wrestled with bronze snakes in the flickering illumination of the pre-dawn meteor showers. I'm not actually sure what that is. Presumably it's some kind of a fountain. Or fountain component.
I'm sorry, Martin, came a familiar voice, but this madness has to end.
King Billy came into my field of view carrying a tall stack of manuscript. Other heaps of pages lay on the shelf of the fountain at the foot of the metal Trojan. An open bucket of kerosene sat nearby. I managed to blink. My eyelids moved like rusted iron.
The stun should wear off any minute,
said King Billy. He reached into the fountain, raised a sheaf of manuscript, and ignited it with a flick of his cigarette lighter.
No!
I managed to scream through clenched jaws. No! There we go. Much better. The flames danced and died. King Billy let the ashes drop into the fountain and lifted another stack of pages, rolling them into a cylinder. Tears glistened on lined cheeks illuminated by flame.
You called it forth,
gasped the little man.
It must be finished.
I struggled to rise. My arms and legs jerked like a marionette's mishandled limbs. The pain was incredible. I screamed again, and the agonized sound echoed from marble and granite. King Billy lifted a fat sheaf of papers and paused to read from the top page.
Without story or prop, but my own weak mortality, I bore the load of this eternal quietude, the unchanging gloom, and the three fixed shapes, ponderous upon my senses a whole moon. For my burning brain I measured sure her silver seasons shedded on the night, and ever day by day I thought I grew more gaunt and ghostly. Oftentimes I prayed, intense, that death would take me from the veil and all its burdens, gasping with despair. Of change, hour after hour, I cursed myself.
King Billy raised his face to the stars and consigned this page to flame. No! I cried again and forced my legs to bend. I got to one knee, trying to steady myself with an arm ablaze with pinpricks, and fell on my side. The shadow in the cape lifted a stack too thick to roll and peered at it in the dim light.
I saw a wan face, not pinned by human sorrows, but bright blanched by an immortal sickness which kills not. It works a constant change, which happy death can put no end to. Death wards, progressing. To no death was that visage. It had passed the lily and the snow, and beyond these I must not think now, though I saw that face.
King Billy moved his lighter, and this and 50 other pages burst into flame. He dropped the burning papers into the fountain and reached for more. Please! I cried, and pulled myself up, stiffening my legs against the twitches of random nerve impulses while leaning against the stone bench. Please! The third figure did not actually appear so much as allow its presence to impinge upon my consciousness. It was as if it had always been there, and King Billy and I had failed to notice it until the flames grew bright enough. Impossibly tall, four-armed, molded in chrome and cartilage, the Shrike turned its red gaze on us. King Billy gasped, stepped back, and then moved forward to feed more cantos to the fire. Embers rose on warm drafts. A flight of doves burst from the vine-choked girders of the broken dome with an explosion of wing sound. I moved forward in a motion more lurch than step. The Shrike did not move. It did not shift its bloody gaze. "Go!" cried King Billy, stutter forgotten, voice exalted, a blazing mass of poetry in each hand. "Return to the pit from whence you came!" The Shrike seemed to incline its head ever so slightly. Red light gleamed on sharp surfaces. "My lord!" I cried, although to King Billy or the apparition from hell I did not know then and know not now. I staggered the last few paces and reached for Billy's arm. He was not there. 1 second the aging king was a hand's length from me, and in the next instant he was 10 meters away, raised high above the courtyard stones. Fingers like steel thorns pierced his arms and chest and thighs, but he still writhed, and my cantos burned in his fists. The Shrike held him out like a father offering his son for baptism. "Destroy it!" Billy cried, his pinned arms making pitiful gestures. "Destroy it!" I stopped at the fountain's edge, tottered weakly against the rim. At first I thought he meant destroy the Shrike, and then I thought he meant the poem, and then I realized that he meant both. 1,000 pages and more of manuscript lay tumbled in the dry fountain. I picked up the bucket of kerosene. The Shrike did not move except to pull King Billy slowly back against his chest in an oddly affectionate motion. Billy writhed and screamed silently as a long steel thorn emerged from his harlequin silk just above the breastbone. I stood there stupidly and thought of butterfly collections I had displayed as a child. Slowly, mechanically, I sloshed kerosene on the scattered pages. "End it!" gasped King Billy. "Martin, for the love of God!" I picked up the lighter from where he had dropped it. The Shrike made no move. Blood soaked the black patches of Billy's tunic until they blended with the crimson squares already there. I thumbed the antique lighter once, twice, a third time. Sparks only. Through my tears I could see my life's work lying in the dusty fountain. I dropped the lighter. Billy screamed. Dimly I heard blades rubbing bone as he twisted in the Shrike's embrace. "Finish it!" he cried. "Martin! Oh, God!" I turned then, took 5 fast paces, and threw the half-full bucket of kerosene. Fumes blurred my already blurred vision. Billy and the impossible creature that held him were soaked like 2 comics in a slapstick holy. I saw Billy blink and sputter. I saw the slickness on the Shrike's chiseled muzzle reflect the meteor-brightened sky, and then the dying embers of burned pages in Billy's still clenched fists ignited the kerosene. I raised my hands to protect my face. Too late. Beard and eyebrows singed and smoldered, and staggered backward until the rim of the fountain stopped me. For a second the pyre was a perfect sculpture of flame, a blue and yellow Pietà with a 4-armed Madonna holding a blazing Christ figure. Then the burning figure writhed and arched, still pinned by steel thorns and a score of scalpeled talons, and a cry went up which to this day I cannot believe emanated from the human half of that death-embraced pair. The scream knocked me to my knees, echoed from every hard surface in the city, and drove the pigeons into wheeling panic. And the scream continued for minutes after the flaming vision simply ceased to be, leaving behind neither ashes nor retinal images. It was another minute or two before I realized that the scream I now heard was mine. Anticlimax is, of course, the warp and way of things. Real life seldom structures a decent denouement. It took me several months, perhaps a year, to recopy the kerosene-damaged pages and to rewrite the burned cantos. It will be no surprise to learn that I did not finish the poem. It was not by choice. My muse had fled. The city of poets decayed in peace. I stayed another year or two, perhaps 5, I do not know. I was quite mad by then. To this day, records of early Shrike pilgrims tell of the gaunt figure, all hair and rags and bulging eyes, who would wake them from their Gethsemane sleep by screaming obscenities and shaking his fist at the silent time tombs, daring the coward within to show itself. Eventually, the madness burned itself out, although the embers will always glow, and I hiked the 1,500 kilometers to civilization, my backpack weighted down with just manuscript, surviving on rock eels and snow and on nothing at all for the last 10 days. The 2.5 centuries since are not worth telling, much less reliving. The Poulsen treatments to keep the instrument alive and waiting. 2 long, cold sleeps in illegal, sublight, cryogenic voyages, each swallowing a century or more, each taking its toll in brain cells and memory. I waited then. I wait still. The poem must be finished. It will be finished. In the beginning was the Word. In the end, past honor, past life, past caring. In the end will be the Word. And that was chapter 3 of Hyperion by Dan Simmons. That was also The Poet's Tale, Hyperion Cantos. So, how about them apples? We get a broader picture of the world web, the hegemony, the hegemony. We get a broader picture of Keats as it was. We get the background story of Martin Silenus, who is far from perfect, but I think he's perfect. I think he's just the best. He's an entertaining character. We get let's see. We get some pretty brutal Shrike antics, which are always a pleasure. Yeah, and we get that much further in unveiling the mystery of Hyperion. Sort of, kind of, not really. Suffice it to say, there's some hints there that will become relevant later. You just don't know which ones, unless you've read it before, in which case you probably do. If you've only read Hyperion and not The Fall of Hyperion, the follow-up, which is also going to be read as part of the Hyperion Cantos, the collection that I'm reading from, that stuff resolves quite a bit more. And what is still unresolved is, well, I won't say it's all resolved, but there's still plenty of stuff that's just kind of like, well, that's just weird stuff. What's going on there? General spookdom. Some of which gets dealt with in Endymion, the 2 Endymion books, Endymion and Rise of Endymion. But some of it is just kind of there, just the mystery. But more facets, basically, in the great jeweled, burning, charnel eyes of the Shrike. As we all might be. Who knows? How much solipsism do you go in for? At any rate, good stuff. A fun chapter. Martin Silenus is a joy.
The next one will probably be a short one, very short. I think it's only like 15 pages at most, if that. Um, and then I guess next Wednesday will be the Scholar's Tale. The River Lethe's taste is bitter. Lethe? How is that pronounced? Lethe. I know what it is. I just don't know how it's pronounced. And that one's a pretty long one. Like that one's a long one even without the interlude portion. That one's just long. It's also extremely meaningful. It's got some of the best human drama in it. Um, it's relatively humdrum, but in the best possible way. Uh, it's hard to explain that when you've had something as kind of riveting and exciting and revelatory as what we just went through. It's kind of more like a slice of life of just how is it to live in the hegemony, and then it becomes something else. They all kind of are slice of life in their little way. Um, I think the next interlude is a fairly long one, though, isn't it? Maybe not. Maybe not. I don't know. I don't know how long the next one is. It's also kind of short. But we're going to keep doing it this way because I don't have a hard idea of what I want to do for Wednesdays anyway, and it'll make this take less weeks to get through. Um, that one's a pretty long one, though, for sure. Oh my gosh, that one I might have to split in half because it's like a huge chunk of the last third of the book. I'm still flipping pages. What is this friggin' thing? Most of them are like 50, 60 pages, but they get longer. Hey, it is. Jeebus, can that be right? Almost 80 pages? It can be right. Well, I've got my work cut out for me. No one ever said this would be easy. I knew going in that this was going to be a daring endeavor, and it is certainly not disappointing in that regard. How long is the last tale in the book? Not that far. Not that far. That far. Well, that one's actually not so long, but it's got a hell of an interlude afterwards. And then an epilogue. So yeah, we're making headway. Headway is being made. Isn't that nice? All right. Hope people dug it. I know I enjoyed it, even though my throat now feels like it's been augured out with quite a lot of sandpaper. Such is the way of things. And I've got a ladybug walking around on my desk somehow. What is going on? How are you here? Where did you come from? I know where it came from. It's been sitting on my drapes for years. How are you alive? I blame the Shrike. Anyway, good times. How is it alive? It has been there literally years. Okay, whatever. I didn't think they lived that long. What do I know? At any rate, Hyperion by Dan Simmons. It's a fun ride. It's a wild ride. Again, sorry to Peter F. Hamilton fans. I enjoy myself some Peter F. Hamilton, but I do have to kind of call it as I see it, where it's like, oh, and like if you've read any of his not Night's Dawn trilogy, that one's relatively original. But the oh, what's that series called? Is that the Commonwealth series? Includes Pandora's Star, Judas Unchained, and then later the I don't even remember what those ones are called. There's like 4 books, and then there's another 4 books, and I can't remember their titles off the top of my head. I've read almost all of them, but let's just say that any good ideas that he had in those that aren't present in the Hyperion cantos are also in uh, are derived from the Endymion duology. Endymion cantos? I don't know. So, good times. Good ideas, don't get me wrong, and I agree with the statement. It's better to plagiarize something good than to invent something bad, but at the same time, at least you'd be trying the act of creation on for size. Anyway, I sound like I'm bashing Peter F. Hamilton, and I don't mean to. Um, he's not bad. He's fine. Um, but man, once you've read these, you're kind of like, well, I see where his good ideas came from. They are good ideas. But yeah, with that, the schedule should be maintained. Hopefully by Friday, I will be completely over this, whatever the hell I've got. And that'll go smoothly, but that's going to be short anyway. I am still doing Mecha Mondays. Anybody who tunes in regularly now knows that I've started doing the novelizations of Mobile Suit Gundam by Yoshiyuki Tomino, the translated version thereof. Um, my edition is from like the early aughts. It was originally published and brought to localized consciousness sometime in the early 90s. Um, I'd love to collect all 3 volumes, but good luck doing that for any reasonable amount of money because it was a short run and they're expensive as hell now. I'd go on to like ABE books to find out, but life's too short. I will look into getting the Ilium if I have not done so already. I know I looked at it um, when I was trying to get more Dan Simmons stuff after someone said, hey, get more Dan Simmons stuff, but I can't remember if I actually went through with it and grabbed it. So give me a minute to look through here. A sec. No, those are Alastair Reynolds. That is not Dan Simmons. That's not the right spot. Don't tug on that. Oh, is that the Hyperion? Okay, that's the Hyperion book socket. I must not have gotten that. Let me check. Nope, that's Prayers to Broken Stones. I know Ilium is big, so it's got to be. If I have it, there's not many places I could have snuck it. Because Ilium is like 2 books. It's another. It's at least 2 books. It's like Hyperion. In fact, it takes a lot of notes from Hyperion structure and concept wise, in terms of basically being a series of literary allusions wrapped up in a thrilling science fiction epic. Or space operatic epic. It sort of transcends sci-fi from what I've gathered. It sort of does its own thing. I mean, transcending sci-fi is such a silly thing to say. I don't want that behind that cover because I will break the book. Okay, at any rate, better well stolen than poorly invented. I basically agree with it. Play your notes right. Come on, Ladybug. I don't want to throw you outside. It's friggin' cold out. But I can't really have a home for you here, you voracious mass murdering demon seed. I don't know if you've ever seen like zoomed in footage of a ladybug going to town on aphids, but it's like puts me off me lunch, doesn't it? It's pretty frightful. At any rate, so yeah, the next one will be Saul Weintraub, and I'm going to have to actually get a voice for him that I can do over long periods. So that's going to be fun. I hope people are okay with me doing these story segments the way I am, trying as best I can in the character's voice. Um, some of that works, some of it doesn't. I'm probably not going to be doing too much of that for the second book because it changes structure so much that it doesn't really need that, although I could technically um, do that. It would work because of the way that one's structured. That one also has ludes and interludes, but it's more like shifting plot perspective rather than it is doing actual backstories. So it's much more contiguous. It's telling much more of a contiguous tale, although there is some disconnection and dislocation there. But that'll make sense when we get there. At any rate, hope people are digging it so far. Glad some people are. And if, as ever, I do these live. I do these live, and I do them on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, starting at about noon Eastern Standard Time. or East Coast US time. And yeah, hope people continue to dig them. I'm going to get updated playlists set up at the end of this week for Volume 2 and Season 2, in quotes, of Mecha Mondays and Free Read Fridays, because I'm going to switch to that format because, again, I was doing backups of my reading material or read aloud material in order to have a hard copy in case my account ever gets DMCA'd or something, which could happen. I'm not going to say it's impossible. If any author ever cared enough to check, you know, sorry, Peter Watts. Sorry, Jeff Vandermeer. Like, your work's good, so yeah, I'm going to read most of it aloud. I know I'm probably safe so long as I'm not making money off of anything, and so far that's not an issue. That's going to change if for some reason I ever got monetized, but whatever. In fact, that's how I'll probably. I haven't gotten the Patreon up yet. I've got half of it worked out, and then the rest I need to sort of just grumble about writing out because I'm not a creative type. Writing out a precious that explains what it's there for. Probably just to be like, you know, don't say you want something specific in return, but like hint it. I can have a Discord channel up and ready basically at the drop of a hat. I have one I can make and put aside. They make that process easy. I'm just not the world's biggest fan of Discord. It's, I think, an easier all-in-one to work with than, say, TeamSpeak, than, say, IRC. I haven't worked with IRC in a decade now, maybe more. So I'd have to relearn how to use that as a platform. Otherwise, I'd do it just to be a giggle a minute. But yeah, I'll get one of those up sometime this month, and then if people want to communicate with me, they can there. Otherwise, just keep leaving comments in the comments, requests and whatnot, or when you're tuning in live. At any rate, thanks again. Stay safe, stay sane, stay toasty or cool as per your preference or geological or geographical location permits, and be decent to each other. Until next time, bye-bye.